Welcome into the January 23rd, 2025 edition of the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show on the Better Sports Network. I am your host, Eric Balkman. You know me from the FFPC, the High Stakes Fantasy Football Hour, and of course, the RotoViz High Stakes Lowdown. Connect with me on X and Blue Sky at Eric Balkman. Joined tonight by Yahoo Fantasy Sports extraordinaire, Scott Pianowski at Scott_Pianowski. Scott, good evening. Hello, and how are you?
I'm doing great, Eric. Always fun to talk sports with you. And, we got a lot to break down, a lot going on.
I don't know when it happened, but I feel like at some point, and you know this better than anybody or as good as anybody, the off-season ceased to exist for content creators and people who cover fantasy football because the season would end. We'd celebrate our championships for about 36 hours. And then you guys, like you and Andy and everybody over at Yahoo, you're already churning out content for next year. In fact, I think you churned out some content for 2025 while the 2024 season is still going on. So you are grinding. Is there any break? Is there any sense of relief a little bit that you get to enjoy before you go hard at it again?
I mean, no, but nobody wants to hear us complain about that. We work in the toy department. We have great jobs. We are not digging ditches here. We are not saving whales. We're writing about a game, and there's always new stuff to unpack. I've been playing for a long time, but I always feel like there's new things I'm uncovering or rules of thumb that I'm maybe reevaluating or whatever it is. And the talent level in the NFL is just so high right now, and the thirst for information, the thirst for what's next. That's the big thrust, right? I mean, everyone wants to know what's next. Well, who's next year's first round? Who's next year's Saquon Barkley? Who's next year's Sam Darnold? Where is Darnold going to be playing, for crying out loud? Where are all the coaches going to land, right? We've seen so many coaching news items in the last few days, and the NFC North has been turned upside down. Liam Coen's going to stay. No, he's going to go. I don't know what he's doing. What do we do with all of our Tampa Bay guys? Who's going to leave in free agency? The draft isn't that far away. The combine is right around the corner. So the NFL, more than any other sport, and I follow all sports. I'm a huge baseball guy. I'm a huge golf guy. I'm a huge hockey guy. I'm a huge basketball guy. But the NFL has managed to make itself a 12-month calendar, I think, unlike any other North American sport, where people care about the combat. Yeah, I've never seen anybody say, okay, I want to go somewhere where they're going to work out all the hockey players and we're going to see how much they weigh and how much they can bench press. We don't do any of that, but people want to have the underwear Olympics with football, and the draft is a cottage industry, and your free agency is so chaotic. And we also know in the NFL, coaching is more important than any other sport. So where these coaches go and what teams get rated, what teams get upgraded, what quarterbacks finally maybe have the right guy whispering to them. And again, back to Darnold and Kevin O'Connell, that was the right whisper for about 3.5 months this year. And it tilted fantasy a lot. It's more important. We don't break into subgroups and say, oh, what hitting coach went to Philadelphia Phillies? Nobody talks like that. But the NFL has a hammerlock on this stuff. And that's why we're going to break it down 12 months a year.
And I think, what's crazy about that is, number one, you're right. It is a 12-month a year thing, but it's the shortest regular season. It's the shortest playing season, essentially. Like, baseball is a marathon. Hockey and basketball have turned into marathons with the playoffs and when training camp starts. Like, it is huge. Football, it's so concise. It's over in the blink of an eye. And then the anticipation, to your point, what's next? That's what we're trying to get. It's what we spend our days. Is people who don't follow other sports, that's all they care about is football. Okay, where's this coach going to go? Who are they going to draft? Who are they going to sign? Stuff like that. We'll try to unpack as much as we can tonight. Regarding everything going on in the offseason right now, including that little bit of breaking news too about Liam Coen. We'll lead things off with that shortly. Coming up on tonight's show, we will go around the NFL, tell you everything that's going on with the teams still in the playoffs, the teams who aren't in the playoffs, and then we're going to go into what we learned in 2024, specifically focusing on tight ends and quarterbacks. I think our first segment is going to be heavily on wide receivers. So basically everything but the running backs tonight. We'll have to talk about running backs some other time, but wide receivers, tight ends, and quarterbacks tonight is what we're focusing on. If you want to put what we're going to be talking about to good use, check out myffpc.com. The FFPC has the Never Too Early Best Ball and the Never Too Early Superflex Best Ball tournaments going on right now. $200 entry fee, $35 entry fee for the Superflex. You can win $40,000 or $10,000 respectively in those contests. They're going to run. They started going on this past Sunday is when we launched them. They're going to go all the way to April 24th, which is the first day of the NFL draft. Then they will stop, and those best ball teams are set it and forget it. So you just watch your team pile up, but no drafts after April 24th. You can draft right now with a 30-second, 2-hour, or 6-hour clock, 60-second clock as well. If you want to play fantasy football 365 days a year, myffpc.com is where to go to pick up a dynasty orphan team. You could pick up a team ranging from $77 all the way up to $5,000, and a lot of those teams have already been discounted for 2025. Remember, FFPC has had 1,800-plus dynasty leagues over the last 15 years, and not a single one has ever folded. So make sure you're getting in one. Play fantasy football year-round, myffpc.com. Scott, let's get into it, and we'll kick things off with this Liam Coen news that we found out roughly an hour before we went on air. Ian Rappaport is reporting that Jacksonville is going to have a second interview with Liam Coen for their head coaching spot. Now, apparently, and I've heard different reports on this, pen was never put to paper by the Buccaneers and Liam Coen to make him one of the, if not the highest paid offensive coordinator or any coordinator in the NFL. I also saw a report that the Buccaneers have been trying to get in touch with Liam Coen. He has not returned any of their texts or calls or contacted him back. He's in the building in Jacksonville, potentially hammering out a contract. Tom Pelissero from the NFL Network says that they appear to be headed towards a deal. This, I think, and Scott, tell me if you disagree with any of this. Shad Khan was upset that Ben Johnson went to the Bears essentially less than 36 hours after he lost to the Commanders in the playoffs. And then he ends up firing Trent Baalke, a guy that seemingly survived the guillotine that we were all surprised at. Well, not all of us, but a lot of people were surprised. He parts ways with him. They need a new GM, and it looks like they're going to get a head coach in Liam Coen. What do we make sense of this right now? And I understand that this could change before we go off the air tonight, but this is really wild stuff. Coen, it seems like odds-on favorite to become the Jaguars' next head coach.
Right, which I guess means that Coen has confidence that he can rebuild or reconstruct Trevor Lawrence. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that Trevor Lawrence was lose all your games, get the number one pick. He's going to transform your franchise, and he has not been that player. And one of the big stories in Jacksonville this year was that Brian Thomas Jr. had such a wonderful year despite Trevor Lawrence, despite Mac Jones, despite Doug Peterson, just a bad infrastructure setup in Jacksonville. And so Liam Coen has to believe that Lawrence is redeemable. And of course, it's hard. You can't, when you have a coordinator this great, it's just the fact that you can keep guys, Detroit was so lucky to keep Aaron Glenn and Ben Johnson that second year. It would have been easy to lose those guys after last year where they somehow lost the NFC Championship game in San Francisco. But it's like keeping them for that one more band back together, run back. And unfortunately, it ended where it did. Now, I don't know where Detroit goes from here, but it's just how are you going to keep these guys down? The game is so predicated on offense. They dictate outcomes. Offense has more year-over-year reliability and continuity. And so it's just a matter of time before somebody makes an offer. I always wonder, because there's no salary cap on coaching, right? I always wonder why don't coaches make ridiculous salaries? What isn't Liam Coen worth whatever they have to pay to keep him, right? Maybe you just give him an oversized check, and that makes up for the fact that he's not the head coach of the team. But it sounds like a Jacksonville deal is likely, if not imminent. And so I guess I have to ask myself, because I'm pretty much 9 toes out on Trevor Lawrence right now. But with Thomas there, with Coen, remember last year, this time of year, Eric, I was worried. Okay, Dave Canales is leaving the room. Right? He was the guy who resurrected Baker Mayfield's career. What are the Buccaneers going to be without Canales? And then Coen was, I think, maybe a sharper guy than Canales. Canales, of course, had a very successful year getting Bryce Young's career rebooted. One of the great stories of the second half of the year and the final quarter of the year, just to see Bryce Young playing really good football, and the young C.J. Stroud situation. We thought that was pretty much over and done with. Now we have to revisit that, and the gap has really been closed. But I was hoping, selfishly, Coen would go back to Tampa Bay, just because Baker, he has his breakout season. What a great story that is. I mean, Cleveland leaves him for dead. They give him away, make a series of bad decisions after that, which we all know about. No fun to talk about. So I don't know what the next step, who the next man is to whisper in Baker's ear. Obviously, there's going to be personnel changes with every team. We don't know if Chris Godwin will come back. Mike Evans is in his 30s. We'll talk about some of the older receivers later on this program. So just when it seemed like maybe Tampa Bay was a very safe offense to bank on, if their architect is out the building, then we have to kind of start from ground zero with the Buccaneers.
And I think that's the actionable advice here, because as you said, we were worried about the Bucs when Canales left, and then we were thrilled when we found out that Coen was apparently coming back. Now it seems like he's not. How much stock do we put in Baker Mayfield and the ground game and the receivers that they have? Chris Godwin might be walking out the door too. We'll get into that in a second. But I think seeing how they reacted and seeing how they performed without Canales, are we giving Liam Coen all the credit, or do we give some of the credit to, like, hey, maybe this team is just resilient. Maybe Baker Mayfield is just good. Like, he could get it done with what he has there. I think there's something to be said for that. And this is the question that we have to answer for anybody playing in the FFPC Never Too Early tournaments. You have to figure out how dialed in are you on the Buccaneers offense right now, after two really talented offensive coordinators have now left this team in back-to-back years.
Right. And we also have to give credit for what they've drafted, right? I mean, Bucky Irving, in a year where rookie running backs largely weren't needed, weren't given opportunities, Bucky Irving was one player who stood out. I don't think Rachaad White's a bad player, but Bucky Irving basically shoved him out of the way. Jalen McMillan was an impact player over the final maybe third of the season or so. A lot of it was touchdown deodorant, but he looks like a nice player. What is his role if Godwin doesn't come back? So there's talent here. Obviously, Evans is on a Hall of Fame trajectory. He got his 1,000 yards. That was a great story in Week 18, even missing a handful of games. When have you ever drafted Mike Evans and regretted it? It's just what a fun player he's been. So success has many parents, unlimited parents, and so does failure. And one of the hardest things we have to do in the NFL, weekly, monthly, seasonally, is who gets the credit and the blame, right? I mean, when the Vikings go to the Rams and get the snot kicked out of them, how much of that is Sam Darnold throwing up all over himself, and how much of that is the Rams having a great play, a great game plan that day, or their defense has gotten better, or maybe they were galvanized by some of the awful things they've been going through in California the last few weeks, and hang in there, everybody who's still dealing with that. What a tragedy that is. And it's hard to know how much credit, how much blame, and even with the great teams in the NFL, the 49ers legacy of how much of it was Bill Walsh, how much of it was Joe Montana, how much of it was Steve Young, how much of it was Jerry Rice, how much of it was a really good offensive line. Roger Craig was a great player. John Taylor was a great player. And we never get over these things. We're going to be arguing this Brady Belichick silliness forever. And it's never a binary answer. It's all about football is such a team game. 11 people line up. If one person blows their assignment, the play is generally stillborn. And, what if Patrick Mahomes was drafted by the Bears? What if Tom Brady was drafted by the Browns? Would these guys have been as successful? What if Jayden Daniels, what if they were flip-flopped, right? What if the Bears drafted Daniels, and what if the Commanders drafted Caleb Williams? I mean, how different would the world be right now? It's hard to know. There aren't right answers. A lot of times this stuff only seems to make sense. I mean, life only makes sense looking backwards. We have to live it forwards. That's like fantasy, right? I mean, we're all saying now, hey, all these veteran running backs, I should have drafted all these guys who changed teams, who are on second contracts, who are getting close to ages we worry about. No, well, they're all going to better offenses, right? Jacobs had a huge year, and Barkley had a huge year, and Henry, who I think most people were in on, had a huge year. Joe Mixon somehow survived a Houston offensive line that was terrible. I thought we were pivoting. I thought the receivers were the safe plays, Eric. All my teams that were receiver heavy, man, did I have a lot of mediocre results because Rashee Rice got hurt, and Chris Olave got hurt and stuff like that. While these running backs were amazingly durable. And so, how much of it is a fluke, how much of it is a one-off, and how much of it is something we can apply forward. There are no fundamental rules on this stuff. A lot of it is, it when you see it. A lot of it is you just kind of make your best guess. And that's all we're doing, right? Is we're all trying to apply what we learned, but it's still a guess. We are aiming at a moving target. And that target never slows down for us.
You mentioned, and we talked about Godwin too. You mentioned about these receivers getting hurt this year. Godwin was like my guy that I was trying to get, not in every draft, because you can't, unless it's like a 19th or 20th round guy. It's really difficult to get the same guy in every draft. But I was trying to get Godwin in a lot of spots, and I did. And I was loving it, man, through the first part of the season. And now it seems like, you look back on the grind that is the season. I feel like it was like 2 years ago when he got hurt, but it was still this season, right? And now talking about Tampa, not only do we have to kind of figure out, okay, what are they going to do at offensive coordinator? What if they do let Godwin get to free agency? What if he doesn't come back to Tampa? You mentioned the touchdown deodorant that Jalen McMillan was rolling on all over his body towards the end of the season. But if he is the number 2 guy next year, and I think he's capable of doing that, does he make sense in the late 5th round or early 7th round, the 2 spots he's gone so far in the FFPC Never Too Early Best Ball Tournament? Does that make sense? We're talking about anywhere from the late 5th to the early 7th. Is he going to return that kind of value? And is that the spot we should be taking him at, knowing what we know now, Scott?
Yeah, a 6 or 7, I'd be more amenable. 5th sounds a little bit too optimistic for me. And you're right, that Godwin breakout, it just seems so long ago. NFL seasons age in dog years. They moved him back to a slot heavy role, and he was one of the right answers. There was at one point where if you had said, who are the 7 or 8 right answers in the fantasy season right now? Chris Godwin was on that list right before he got hurt. Into an age 29 season, what team does he go to? Tampa Bay, we mentioned all the young talent again. Irving has a great rookie year. McMillan came on late. Even guys like Cade Otton, who's in his mid-20s, he had maybe a month of relevance. When the receivers got hurt, it was really Otton who stepped up before. McMillan wasn't great right away when Evans and Godwin got hurt. It was really in the later part of the season where he started to spread his wings and maybe be a little bit more diversified with his route running. So there's a lot of talent here. And again, we don't know who's calling the plays, right? We don't, if Coen sounds like maybe he's, 1.5 feet out the building. So who's the new guy there? And obviously a veteran quarterback is going to be almost like a quasi offensive coordinator to some extent. This is Baker Mayfield's team now. Man, a lot to unpack with it. With a Tampa Bay team that, you look at that division, the Saints are in salary cap hell. I think they're going to be bad again. It's going to be the first full year of Michael Penix. We'll see what they offer. This was a fun division. Carolina's on the upswing. I was in on a lot of Carolina stuff. Chuba Hubbard worked out. Most of the other things did not, although we got a little bit of a late kick from Young. And Adam Thielen, well into his 30s, had maybe a final month or so of relevance. I don't know if we can count on that going forward. They could really use an impact receiver in that offense. But it was a fun division with flawed teams. I think we're going to see these teams all be flawed. Tampa Bay is going to lose personnel, and it's hard. The thing with Penix is I'm just glad he's not Kirk Cousins, right? I'm just so glad to be unsubscribed from the Kirk Cousins experiences. Fastball couldn't be stopped for speeding in a school zone, and just defenders just picking on those outside throws. It was just how many points did Atlanta leave on the field every week? It felt like, ironically, except when they were playing Tampa Bay, Kirk Cousins for whatever reason knew how to solve the Buccaneers defense, but nobody else's. But yeah, Tampa Bay's a flashpoint offense because they were. I think along with the Bengals, they were probably your best bang for buck offense, where it's not like you went to a draft and you had to fight everybody off for these guys, right? I mean, everybody knows that the 3, 4, 5, everybody wanted Lions, right? Or everybody wanted Chiefs. Maybe that didn't really come back. It wanted Buffalo Bills, Baltimore Ravens, stuff like that. If you had targeted the Tampa Bay offense as a whole, and you're not going to get everybody you want. As you mentioned, a lot of it should come down to timing and what your slot is and what your roster build looks like. But if you had said, okay, there's like 3 or 4 offenses I think are really undervalued right now before the season. If you had located Tampa Bay as one of those guys, man, you would have made a huge profit because they were just ADP beaters all over the roster at all 4 positions.
I think that you said it best. It's a fun division. That NFC South is going to be a fun division for fantasy again too. I'm excited for the Penix experience in Atlanta for a full season in Atlanta. But I think it comes back to Tampa. Even with all the changes, right? Godwin could be gone. They have McMillan. Rashad White took a back seat last year. That's okay. They had Bucky Irving. Dave Canales walks out the door. Liam Coen saved the day, and now somebody else is going to have to. The one constant, seemingly since the 1980s, has been Mike Evans. Mike Evans has been there for forever and put up big-time numbers. I have this guy in a dynasty league, and like part of a ritual, at least over the last 3 years, Scott, is I sit down and I was like, okay, do I need to start shopping this guy? Do I need to cash out on Evans? And every single time I come to the answer, come to the conclusion, nope, I'm going to let it roll one more year. I haven't gotten to that point yet where I'm going to sit down and decide, am I going to send out offers, including this guy? But what's the answer this year? Should we continue to be in on Mike Evans, 11 straight years of 1,000 yards or more? Father Time is undefeated. Does Father Time strike a chord this year with Mike Evans?
Man, I hate saying this because he's one of my favorite players, but I'm leaning towards a fade of Evans this year into age 32 season. To double-digit touchdowns in 4 of the last 5 years. We know he's had the 1,000 yards receiving every year, and he's even gotten home in some incomplete seasons like last year. I did an article on Yahoo maybe 2 weeks ago where I looked at all the 30-something receivers. There were 12 of them that I focused on, and 11 of them had worse fantasy returns this year. Now some of them, they still returned their ADP, and Evans was one of those guys. But there are some collapses. Tyreek Hill absolutely collapsed. He's one of those guys, one of the total right answers. In fact, the only one of the 12 who had a higher return for fantasy points was Cooper Kupp, who rose from wide receiver 39 to 36 in the data that I used. And, getting Cooper Kupp as wide receiver 36 was still an ADP loss. So the older I get for fantasy, the more age sensitive I become. And it's a young person's game. And I realize I talked about the running backs earlier, all those second contract running backs and how well they returned this year. But it's a young person's game. It's not that uncommon for these players to come into the NFL and be ready. And also we're seeing now with the rules changing in the college game with the NIL and with the transfer portal, it used to be anybody who stayed in college more than 3 years probably couldn't play. And it was a condemnation of them. Now we see guys 4 years, 5 years. I mean, Bo Nix was in college longer than some of the Animal House guys. and that's a bug, a feature, not a bug, right? It's like maybe they're more ready to play. Jayden Daniels, bounced around. He was at Arizona State with Herm Edwards for a while, ends up at LSU, has that unbelievable season last year, obviously tied to some really great receivers who joined the NFL, and they were awesome as well. It's just, I just want to go back and watch all those LSU games, not just with Jayden Daniels, but that Joe Burrow Heisman season. With how does Justin Jefferson go after Jalen Reagor? I'll never understand that. Jamar Chase just won the Triple Crown. It's just fun when you see all this talent coalesce at the same time. But I'm trying to get more young, this player hasn't had his career season yet, still on the escalator, that type of thing. I'd rather be a year early than a year late. Mike Evans has been good to me. I can't remember ever drafting him and regretting it, even years where he hasn't played full seasons, but into an age 32 year with maybe some moving parts in this Tampa Bay offense. I'm not going to dismiss him out of hand. I'm never going to do that. But right now I would say Mike Evans is more of a reactive pick than a proactive pick for me in 2025.
Yeah. And I think I'm cautiously coming your direction on this. I think that's where I'm going to end up as well. You bring up Burrow, and I was just talking when I was with some friends watching the national championship game on Monday night. And I don't know how we got on the subject of it, but we were talking about that LSU team from 2019. And I had to look up the stats because I remember how insane they were. Burrow threw for 5,600 yards and 60 touchdowns that year. 60. College player, 60 touchdowns against 6 picks. He was averaging 378 yards a game. Averaging 378 yards a game. Jamar Chase, 84 catches. That wasn't even tops on the team. Justin Jefferson had 111 for 1,540 yards. That wasn't even tops on the team. Jamar Chase had 1,780 yards receiving that year. This is college. I'm sorry. Are they playing Big 12 games every single week? It was insane. And then obviously Jefferson, 18 touchdowns. Jamar Chase, 20 touchdowns. And the guy who fooled us all, 1,400 yards on the ground, 55 catches, 400 yards, 17 touchdowns. Clyde Edwards-Helaire.
Yeah.
Right. And he fooled the Chiefs too. And if you could pull that off, congratulations, because that ain't easy to do.
I have a theory. I have a theory on Jefferson, by the way, that his numbers were too good that the Eagles looked at him and Reagor and they thought, well, Jefferson, it's a pinball game. It's not real football. I think if maybe Jefferson had 80 catches for like 1,300 yards and 13 touchdowns, maybe the Eagles would have taken him more seriously. I think his stats were just so bloated that they just couldn't. It's like when you look at like Wilt Chamberlain stats, like he averaged 50 points a season. Like we don't know how to relate to that. Right. You look at like what Juan Soto makes, versus what we make or something like that. We can't relate to some numbers because they're so big. And I just wonder if LSU stats were so great that's why Philadelphia said, no, maybe we have to think scout wise, and Jalen Reagor is more our speed. It's just as a long suffering, I know nobody would feel sorry for the Patriots, but as a long suffering Patriots fan, N'Keal Harry in the 2019 draft or Jalen Polk in the 2024 draft. And I just look at like Terry McLaurin making a catch and run touchdown. I'm thinking, the Patriots could have had him. They wanted N'Keal Harry. Or I look at Jalen Polk and I think, well, they had that pick that was Lad McConkey. He looked pretty good in the Patriot uniform for 10 years. Instead, we get Jalen Polk. I don't know why New England can't seem to draft a receiver in recent years. A couple of these draft classes have been unbelievable, but man, it's fun. It's fun. You look back at some of the talent Alabama had at the same time, some of the talent Miami had 2003, 2014 with Frank Gore, Clinton Portis, Willis McGahee all on the same team. A bunch of Sean Taylor was on the defense. Willis McGahee. It's just fun to see Alabama at one point, or guys who have to leave. Right, Jamison Williams had to leave Ohio State to get playing time. He went to Alabama, right? Because he couldn't get playing time at Ohio State. And man, look at that receiver room. Ohio State always seems to have the best receiver room. And just I can't wait to see when some of these guys go pro from Ohio State. I hope they can stay healthy. On some of those guys haven't been able to, and I'm dying to see Garrett Wilson play with the right situation. He hasn't had it yet, but man, it's just with some of these teams stockpile talent at the same time. It's what a great time to be a fan. Just sit back and watch him go.
Yeah, and Jeremiah Smith is going to be the next one, and we got to wait 2 years for him. That's what's so frustrating about it is we got to watch him. And I'm in Wisconsin, so I'm a Badgers fan, and I got to watch Jeremiah Smith go 11 for 180 and 3 touchdowns at Camp Randall in Madison next year, which I'm not looking.
The number one player in his draft class, in his recruiting class too, not the number one receiver. He was the number one player. And I realize you look back on some of this stuff, it doesn't make sense. And then sometimes you see, Eric, you look back on some of the I love looking at these old recruiting things. I love looking at old NBA drafts, MLB drafts, who was drafted in front of who. Mike Schmidt and George Brett were drafted right next to each other. How cool was that? How does Sam Bowie ever go in front of Michael Jordan when the league was center driven at the time? Amon-Ra St. Brown in his recruiting class was the number 2 receiver, and he goes to USC and he's doing fine. And then he gets hurt his final year at USC. He ends up being a 4th round pick of the Lions. That's how you get the sun god, who is a 1st round player, of course, and will be a 1st round player in every fantasy format next year, no matter who the coordinator is. But, guys who just get hurt at the wrong time, their draft stock slips. How does Rob Gronkowski not go in the 1st round? Well, he was hurt in college, stuff like that. Curtis Martin was a player who was hurt in college. Sometimes guys are in the wrong situation. Guys need to bounce around. Look what Russell Wilson, right? He was not sure if he wanted to play baseball or football. North Carolina State got sick of waiting for him. He, torpedoes over to Wisconsin. Your Badgers has an unbelievable season. I thought he deserved more Heisman Trophy juice that year. I think he came in 9th. And then Russell Wilson, I hope people remember. I know he's kind of a little bit of a joke right now. He didn't have a great year with Denver. He didn't have up and down year with Pittsburgh. We know the way their season ended. What a strange time to be a Steeler fan. Is Mike Tomlin the man? Because winning season every season, you go to the playoffs. There's Mike Tomlin the problem because they never win these playoff games. They're not really a championship contender. Russell Wilson, I thought, was like a toe away from being like a slam dunk Hall of Famer. He needed like one more great season. I don't know that he's going to have it, but I hope people remember just what an amazing player he was at Wisconsin, at Seattle, won championships. I mean, was a great run pass threat, was somebody who carried people to even his rookie year. He got more responsibility that first season and had unbelievable December, carried me to a couple of championships. I hope people remember the player Russell Wilson was for the front 9 of his career.
Yeah, I hope so too, because it was amazing. His last year at NC State was solid. He went to another level at Wisconsin, and then for him to get drafted by the Seahawks in the 3rd round after they spent all that money on Matt Flynn to come over, and then Wilson beats him out, and he's the starter from the get-go, leads the Seahawks to a Super Bowl victory, led him to another NFC championship. I thought he was a really good player, and I hadn't really considered the Hall of Fame argument, but you're right. He wasn't far away. He probably won't get there now, but he wasn't far away for sure. One of the things that I did not realize, because I read this piece that you did for Yahoo on these receivers that have already hit their peak, their prime, and are maybe on the downside of their career, these post-30-year-old guys. I did not realize Calvin Ridley turned 30 in December. Had no idea. I was reading through all the receivers, like, why is Scott talking about Calvin Ridley? And then I looked at his age. I'm like, my God, Calvin Ridley's already 30 years old. Unbelievable stuff. I want to, and we'll talk about Ridley in a second, but I want to get your philosophy, your drafting philosophy on these receivers who we have already seen their best football. Their best football is not in front of them anymore. I don't want to say you have an unbreakable rule when it comes to this. You have a bendable rule, a rubric you kind of follow with these receivers once they get in to their age 30 seasons and beyond. How do you treat them? What's the proper way to handle them? I know it's kind of an unfair question because I think it's every case is different, but is there something that you sort of follow when you're thinking about drafting these players?
You're totally right that every case is different. And, in the case of Ridley, it's what quarterback is he going to be tied to? He was tied to poor quarterback play this year. Although for some reason, Nick Westbrook-Akine had a 2-month stretch where he couldn't miss from scoring touchdowns. And wasn't it nice to see Chico Okonkwo get going at the end of the season? I think a lot of us had Chig shares that have not come to fruition. And then it was just nice to be validated at the end of the year. But it ultimately, it comes down to a marketplace, right? And you can love a player, and if the market loves the player more than you do, or as much as you do, that creates maybe some hesitation to want to buy. Or you can be lukewarm on a player, but if the whole market seems to be out on him, then you just kind of shrug and take that sort of player. The problem with me with Ridley is that I haven't seen him be explosive since. I think missing that season really took something out of him. I don't know what it was. He's bounced around to a couple of teams, and they haven't been great infrastructures. We talked about not trusting Jacksonville, not trusting Peterson, who's gone, not trusting Trevor Lawrence. We'll see if he can get fixed with a new regime. And then he goes to Tennessee, where the quarterback play was among the worst in the league. They're bouncing between guys. I mean, when we're begging for Mason Rudolph to play to save the offense, that just tells you how bad Will Levis was. There were games where both of those guys played. Also, somehow they covered twice over the course of an NFL season, man. There should be a 30 for 30 or a documentary on that, man. I don't know why I didn't figure out all year, just bet against the Titans and repeat until rich, and then Christmas is free. But that's the way it was. But maybe Ridley was just a first-round pick, an Alabama guy, somebody who we thought was going to take the baton from Julio Jones, didn't quite measure up. And by the way, I think Julio Jones is a Hall of Famer too. But maybe it's just Ridley's just destined to be a inefficient player and occasionally productive player, but not somebody who we can trust week in, week out. So I'm going to really like what's been built around him, whether it's the quarterback they land or the play caller they get. Obviously, a lot of moving parts with that offense. He's somebody I'm out on until I'm going to have to be talked into Calvin Ridley, I guess. And just the fact that he's into an age 31 season, that's just another strike against him as I start preparing my 25 board.
Is he, top 35 receiver this year?
I'm thinking low 40s probably on my early board.
Low 40. Okay. Let's move on and talk about something Tom Smith pointed out in the chat earlier on YouTube. He says, "Hi, Balky and Scott. I've seen a rumor for the third time now, DK Metcalf to the Chargers." And I want to address this because I was talking with Justice Mosqueda, formerly of Football Guys, Acme Packing Company, covers the Packers there. And he wrote a piece talking about why Metcalf might make some sense in Green Bay as, the field flipper that they're not going to have with Christian Watson. I don't think, Scott, I don't think he plays next season at all. And they're going to need that they were sorely missing that element in that offense the last 3 games of the season. I digress. Metcalf is under contract with the Seahawks for this year. He has a cap hit, I believe, of $32 million this year. The Seahawks are $28 million over the cap, and they had Jackson Smith and Jigba last year take a huge step forward as the number 1 guy. His numbers dwarf DK Metcalf. Tyler Lockett seems like he's on his way out as well. Certainly, by doing some lazy analysis here, it would seem that Seattle needs to get under the cap, and Metcalf, who is going to be looking for another contract, would be a guy that could be moved on from. If we are drafting Metcalf right now, do we need to draft him with the intention that he will be playing elsewhere other than Seattle, perhaps as a number 1 receiver? Or is that still unlikely at this point and they find a way to make it work and he's in the teal and blue, the green, whatever the colors are for Seattle for another season? How do you feel about drafting Metcalf right now?
Yeah, it's a lot of great questions. Also, coordinator change too. The Grubb experiment did not work out. But they moved the ball plenty in Seattle. They were so bad in the red area. And I'm a Geno Smith guy, but for whatever reason, they just couldn't kind of whisper. At least we had the JSN breakout, which took a while. I was waiting. I remember 4 or 5 weeks in, I was like, where are these explosive JSN games? And of course, they started raining like crazy. But Lockett probably the end of his usefulness, and Metcalf, he's a frustrating guy because we see the type of dominant player he can be. And yet he loses his head sometimes. He'll take a personal foul. He'll run a lazy route. He seems like his focus isn't there sometimes for 3 hours at a time. I could see it being a good period with Seattle in their financial straits. Maybe they need to take a longer view, and maybe it's time just to have, I would love to see DK Metcalf motivated by a new situation, right? And get him to play with some new playmates, a different quarterback, a different setup. Maybe it was just time for an amicable splitting between him and team. I hadn't really thought about it until you mentioned it, but it seems to make a lot of sense for me. I wonder if maybe he's not a part of the next great Seattle team. With the understanding, I mean, look at that. And I talked about the NFC South being a fun division. I mean, the NFC West, every team at one point looked like the team that should win that division. We thought it was going to be San Francisco. Everything went wrong. At one point, Arizona had a game up on everybody, and then they had a terrible final third of the season. Seattle was the favorite at one point, and the Rams ultimately took that division. I think any of these teams could look at themselves as playoff contenders next year. It's an age 28 season for Metcalf. You got to be interested now. Now I'm thinking, DK Metcalf, and you mentioned the Chargers, right? What do they have? A great slot receiver in Lad McConkey. We know Johnson had an in-and-out season. They need downfield. They've been linked a lot to maybe getting Tee Higgins. They need an outside playmaker. DK Metcalf on the Chargers, yeah, I'd be pretty in on that.
Yeah, him and McConkey, I mean, I think they're complementary guys, obviously. And you have a guy like Justin Herbert. And what, we talked about how good the NFC North was this year, best division in football, and then they don't win a game in the playoffs. But you look at what could be coming up next year in the AFC West, Kansas City, the Chargers, the Broncos. There's 3 really good teams there, and then perhaps the Raiders can cobble something together as well. Speaking of the Raiders, a guy who started the season on that team was Davante Adams. He gets traded to the Jets, still has 2 more years on his contract, and there is probably a pretty good chance he is not on the Jets next year. He is being drafted right now, Scott, in the FFPC Never Too Early Best Ball Tournament, on average at the 408, wide receiver 21, right behind DJ Moore and Rashee Rice, right ahead of Brandon Ayuk and Jalen Waddle. Obviously, people who are drafting him right now do not know who is going to be throwing him the ball. And I ask you, how important is that when you are a future Hall of Famer in Davante Adams? How important is your quarterback? When this guy's been able to get it done with guys like Aiden O'Connell throwing it to him, he's still doing numbers. How much should we be concerned about that if we're picking Adams in the 4th round?
Yeah, well, into an age 33 season. Last year, his yards per target dips down to a number we're not used to in the mid 7s. I think he's more of a volume guy and a touchdown guy last year than he was an efficiency player. Obviously, we saw Aaron Rodgers had his favorite receiver, and maybe to the detriment of Garrett Wilson. And I am ready to unsubscribe from the Aaron Rodgers documentaries, podcast appearances, media hits. Aaron Rodgers is a walk-in Hall of Famer. It's amazing he only went to the 1 Super Bowl, but I'm ready for Aaron Rodgers to do something else that doesn't have anything to do with football or being on my TV, computer, radio. I'm ready. Just do something else. We'll see you in 5 years. I'm sure you'll give a heck of a speech. But Rodgers into an age 33 season, and also a guy who his skill has always been precise route runner, can win contested catches, the back shoulder throws, really good with spacing, really good with leverage. I just wonder how that type of player ages. And again, there's nothing wrong with what he did as age 32 season, but into age 33, having to build up rapport with a new quarterback, it's going to, if I were co-managing with somebody, they'd have to really be persuasive to win the Davante Adams argument. I think I'm going to be underweight on him next year.
And we've been talking about some of the guys that are going outside of, the top 15 receivers, going outside the top couple of rounds. Tyreek Hill is a player that was drafted last year, Scott, in the first half of drafts, like the first half of the first round. This year, in the FFPC ADP I have, shout out to Fantasy Mojo and Darren Armani for this, he has fallen to wide receiver 12, still going in the 3rd round, high 3rd round at the 303, but behind London and Garrett Wilson, ahead of McConkey and Higgins. I can't remember who it was. It was somebody on one of my shows. I think it was a good old Permar who likes to hang out in the chat. He pointed out that since Tunga Vailoa came back from that concussion, you saw a huge emphasis on targets to Achane and to Jonnu Smith, a.k.a. balls that were getting out of Tagovailoa's hand right away, where he was not subjected to sitting back in the pocket, letting routes develop for Hill and Waddle. Does that change in 2025? Is Tyreek Hill in for a bounce back? I mean, certainly he did not have the season we wanted. He's fallen to the third round. This is another case of a receiver getting up there in age, and we kind of got to finesse it a little bit to figure out how much of this was the situation he was in and how much of it is, where he is on the age spectrum coming into 2025.
It blows my mind. He had the long touchdown in week 1, and obviously there's a lot of things to unpack with that game, the strange arrest and everything, but he still was a monster in that game. The rest of the season, he did not have a reception over 30 yards. This is Tyreek Hill, the best deep threat you would think in the NFL, and how much of that was Tua's injuries and not wanting him to hold the ball. And, as your listeners and your readers are talking about, the shape of this offense, the scheme of this offense, the scope of this offense, totally different. Am I ever going to be really 2 feet in on Tua? Mike McDaniel's somebody we need to reevaluate. Tyreek's always been a little bit of a different wiring cat, right? Sometimes he talks about how much longer do I really want to play? Do I want to be here? He talked himself out of Kansas City. Now you've heard whispers, I want to leave Miami. No, I was just all, frustration. We just lost the game and everything like that. This is just a different type of cat we're talking about. I'm afraid I could get beat by not taking Tyreek Hill. But again, I don't trust the quarterback. I'm not sure that McDaniel, I'm disappointed that McDaniel did not come with more proactive ways to use his best downfield passing option. Another pick that's going to be reactive for me in 2025. And if I get beat by Tyreek Hill, I can live with it, knowing that, he basically had the Jamar, this Chase season, the Jamar Chase season last year, right? Where all the black ink, right? We led the league in receiving yards and touchdowns. That was just a year ago. And it just, again, speaks, Eric, to how NFL seasons age in dog years, right? That 2023 season feels like it was 5 years ago.
Which is crazy. But it is. I mean, and I look at some of these other guys that you had posted in your article about these older receivers. And it's amazing. Some of these guys still seem super young to me. Amari Cooper still seems young. A guy that outplays his ADP seemingly every single year, except in 2024. Didn't come close to it. But he seems young to me yet. Stephon Diggs still seems young to me. DeAndre Hopkins, I still feel like he was the guy that I was watching on Hard Knocks toast these corners, in the summer, and getting me so excited for having him on the Texans. And then you come to a guy like Cooper Kupp. It just seems like yesterday he was the offensive player of the year, and now he's failing to get targets, much less catches, down the stretch for the Rams. Of those guys, Cooper, Diggs, Hopkins, Kupp, none of them have been drafted so far in the never too early slow drafts that we've had going on, and we're at wide receiver 36, and none of these guys have been going off there. So they're going to be going on average behind those players. Scott, if you were going to sell me on one of these guys, Cooper, Diggs, Hopkins, Kupp, which one would be the one that you would have the most of, you think, in 2025 drafts?
Man, I'm really not eager to draft any of them. If I could get a good medical prognosis on Diggs, maybe I could talk myself into that. I'm afraid Kupp is done. And Cooper, man, they can't get him on the field. He's part of a 4-man rotation. It's never a surprise when he has like 1 or 2 targets. It's never a surprise when he has a puny snap participation, route participation, and they're winning games. They see no reason. I know he had that one game against the Rams where he had the 14 targets. Even that was just a 6-catch game, but Cooper was Amari Cooper was traded in the middle of the season before and beat it, right? And he went from the Raiders to the Cowboys and was great right away. So it's not like he's not a smart guy or can't assimilate to a new team. They feel no urgency to try to fast track him. This is a team that they have a bunch of different guys. It's at a point now, Eric, where I watch a Buffalo game and they complete a pass downfield. I'm like, oh yeah, it must be Mac Hollins, or maybe it's Keon Coleman. I never expected to be Amari Cooper.
yeah, it's true. And there was it the game? I can't remember if it was the division or might have been the wild card game where I was watching that game, and in the third quarter, somebody made a catch on the sideline, and I'm like, God, who is that? And it was Amari Cooper. It was like an 8-yard out or something like that, and he caught him. Like, God, I totally forgot he was on that team, which is unbelievable stuff. So here's the roundup to the receiver conversation. you can still be good and you could still be worthy and you could still be a guy that we want to be in business with, even if you're over the age of 30 in 2025. However, Scott, those cases are not numerous. They are few and far between. And I think when in doubt, look at the younger guys before the older guys.
I mean, what did Belichick teach us for years is to be a year early, not a year late, right?
Mm-hmm.
The one player I'm probably going to make the excuses for is Mike Evans. He's the one guy who I'm like, yeah, I'm going to have some Evans in my profile. He's just done it too many times. And Baker and he have a connection that I don't see with some of these other guys, right? I mean, and also with Cooper Kupp, he's clearly been usurped by somebody. I mean, Puka Nacua is so much younger and so much more dynamic now. There's no way they can unsee that. But Evans is the guy I'm more likely to see. Yeah, okay, I'll find a way. I don't want to sit out the Mike Evans experience. And I guess depending on the flow of the offseason, maybe Tyreek Hill could work his way into that conversation too. A lot of these guys are just going to be players I'm just not going to look at proactively.
The wide receiver conversation may have come to a close here between Scott Pianowski from Yahoo Fantasy Sports and myself, but the tight end conversation is just beginning. I want to talk about Mark Andrews' magnet for touchdowns that he had towards the end of the season. I want to talk about Dalton Kincaid versus Kyle Pitts. Who would you rather have? Neither is a choice there as well. And then Sam LaPorta. ADP was out of control last year. It's much more palatable this year. Let's talk about him as we get into our tight end conversation. It's the What We Learned in 2024 edition of the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show on the Better Sports Network. Scott Pianowski and Eric Balkman coming at you. Don't go anywhere. We roll on next.
If you want to play Dynasty, if you haven't played yet, it's hard to like get a good league together of people like buddies or whatever, and then say, oh, everyone's going to pay and everyone's going to pay attention. Usually you can get like 7 people that actually care, and the rest are fill-ins, and they mess up the whole league because they don't want to trade. They don't pay attention, right? So if you're looking for a serious place to play, go to myffpc.com, use promo code COOP. They'll give you $25 when you deposit 35 or more, and you can go over there and you can either do a startup draft where you draft in from scratch, draft in a brand new team, rookies, everything included, or you can adopt an orphan team where you go in and take a team that somebody gave up on, and that's a lot of fun because you separate the players you like from the ones you don't, and now you got a bunch of trade chips and pieces, and that's a true measure of how good of a fantasy player you are if you can take one of these orphan teams and battle back to win, man. So, yeah, FFPC, really cool place to play. There you go, right there. You can use the QR code, get set up. It also supports the show. So if you're looking for a place to play and want to support me, use promo code COOP. They'll give you $25 when you deposit 35 or more, and you can play best ball, you can play Dynasty. And if you're a Fantasy Alarm member, just hit me up in the Discord on Coop's Corner and post your team. Whatever. I say this all the time. I'm like, you have direct access to me. Go to Coop's Corner in the Discord as a Fantasy Alarm member, and we can talk about whatever. We can talk about, watches, shoes, sunglasses, whatever you want to talk about. But I like talking about football mostly. And you can post your new team in there and I'll fix it up, right? I'll help you with it and we'll win some money together. It'll be a good time. So use promo code COOP, myffpc, and get set up now at fantasyalarm.com in the Discord. Let's go.
12 minutes until the top of the hour. You're watching the High Stakes Fantasy Football Hour here on the Better Sports Network. I'm Eric Balkman. He's Scott Pianowski from Yahoo Fantasy Sports. You heard Andrew Cooper from Fantasy Alarm there talking about those dynasty orphans that we have at the FFPC. Check them out. Entry fees range from $77,000 to $5,000. You can pick up any of those teams right now. Manage them 365 days a year. Many of them have entry fees discounted for 2025. MyFFPC.com is where to go. 1,800 plus leagues. None have folded in the last 15 years. MyFFPC.com is where to go for that. We are talking Dynasty. We are talking mostly about the never too early best ball tournaments going on with the FFPC and how we handle the players drafted last year or how we handle the players that are being drafted this year in regards to what they did last year. Obviously, we don't want to have recency bias affecting us in a negative way, but certainly we remember what happened, Scott, last year the best. And what did we see with tight ends this year? This is something you wrote about for Yahoo as well. The best tight ends, the tight ends with the best season, not only was that impressive to do at an NFL level, but to do it the way they did it with what you called chaos surrounding them on their offenses. Pretty impressive stuff what Kittle, McBride, and these guys did. Why were the best tight ends this year seemingly surrounded by all this noise going on around them, and they still came through?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just a case of the one thing that the offense could hang their hat on, right? San Francisco, another team that really struggled in the red zone. It seemed like the only thing they could do in the red zone that made any sense was throw the ball. George Kittle, another player I think is on a Hall of Fame trajectory, by the way. So Kittle ends up having monster year. Brock Bowers, second year in a row, we've seen a rookie tight end break all the rules. I mean, Sam LaPorta rewrote those rules, and then Brock Bowers just took a shredder to them. Didn't matter that the quarterback play was poor. They lost Davante Adams early in the season. The running game was kind of hit and miss. Raiders, one of the 3 or 4 worst teams in football, but didn't hold Bowers back. McBride, I joke that he won the Deontay Johnson Award, the touchdown the touchdown allergy, where he had all the targets and none of the touchdowns. And of course, finally scores the last 2 weeks of the NFL season when couldn't really help most fantasy managers. I blame that touchdown gap on the play calling. I blame it on Kyler Murray, who unfortunately is just never going to get any taller. And I just wonder if he maybe can't connect with McBride the way we want to in the red zone. But McBride's volume was great. And Jonnu Smith, there's the hardest one of all of them, right? We all knew Kittle was great. We all knew Bowers came into the league with all these credentials. McBride had a monster season last year, so his monster season this year was really no surprise. But Jonnu Smith passed around, been with a bunch of teams. There's been times in Atlanta where he would be getting targets. We're like, no, we want those targets to go to Kyle Pitts. Why are they going to Jonnu Smith? Who knew in a year where Miami's offense would fall apart that Jonnu Smith would be the right answer? And he, for about 8 weeks, he was the dominant tight end. A really tough call for next year. But what these guys all have in common, the chaos, right? The receivers getting hurt, receivers underperforming, quarterback injuries at times. None of these teams went anywhere. None of them were playoff teams. So it's sometimes we like to think of it's as simple as identify the best players on the best teams and draft those guys. But sometimes it's identify the best players on the disappointing teams and they become the featured part of their offenses. And I like to tell myself a story with a tight end. Can I see this player leading this team in red zone targets or touchdowns or overall targets in general? And it turns out all 4 of these guys became volume monsters, and it wasn't easy to get to any of those guys before the season. We didn't know that Adams was going to get traded. We didn't know that Tyreek Hill was going to have a horrible season. We didn't know that Marvin Harrison would be a disappointment in Arizona. He's a tough call next year. We didn't know all these receivers would get hurt in San Francisco and they would be a non-playoff team. So maybe you need a little bit of luck. The ball bounces your way a little bit, but it's just funny how all 4 of these tight ends thrived with chaos all around them.
Yeah, and they got it done, and they came through for everybody who drafted him, who invested into Kittle, into Bowers, McBride. The list goes on. They certainly helped you win titles this past year. Now, at the top of that list, arguably the greatest rookie pass catching season ever, tight end, receiver, whatever. Brock Bowers is going as the tight end 1 in the best ball, never too early best ball tournament right now. I had a conversation with FFPC co-founder Dave Gerzak about a month and a half or so ago, and he said, Balky, 101, Brock Bowers, FFPC next year. And I said, whoa. But then I thought about it. I'm like, well, I could actually see that, and then I talked to some other high stakes players, and they kind of just threw cold water and like, well, I could see him maybe top 3 or top 5, but not 101. So far, he has gone as high as the 102, Scott. He has settled in at the 103. Obviously, FFPC having the tight end premium scoring here. Is that too high for Brock Bowers, given the I'm trying to think of the flexibility is not the right word, but given how chaotic, I guess, the tight end position can be for fantasy football, and how there are so many misses at the position. Is that too high, top 3 overall in tight end premium scoring to take Brock Bowers in 2025?
I can see why people are doing it. I mean, he's a hybrid player. He's somebody everybody. Look, I'm a Jacoby Myers fan, but every Raiders opponent in the second half of the year got off the bus thinking, how do we stop Brock Bowers? And the answer is you don't. And his quarterbacks didn't stop him. His play calling didn't stop him. The team losing didn't stop him. And it's almost just a shame that we mentioned Lad McConkey in the previous segment. It's almost a shame that Georgia didn't need to throw the ball more when they had both these guys, because maybe their talent was a little bit hidden because they could run all over people and they won so many games lopsided and their stats weren't as bloated as they could have been. We talked about some of those LSU offenses putting up pinball stats. Georgia has not been a pinball passing game, even though they have these two players who are going to be NFL stars for the next 10 years. I don't think there's a way to stop Bowers because he's moved so well laterally. He already has great diversity with his route tree. And I dare the Raiders to have a worse quarterback room next year than they did this year. So in a format like FFPC where the tight end gets the premium scoring, obviously some people are there's going to be difference of roster build. Some people are going to lean into that. Some people are not going to, and maybe hope to get lucky with the Jonnu Smith or something like that later in the draft, or maybe try to find next year's Brock Bowers, whoever they may be. A really good rookie tight end class coming into the league, by the way. So we'll have guys to talk about there in the next few months. But I don't think Brock Bowers can be stopped because I think he actually had plenty of things that should have stopped him this year, and they didn't.
Yeah. I've seen these games. I watch those Raiders games, just waiting for him. And I'd watch some of them, Scott, and like at halftime he'd have like one catch for 6 yards, or maybe he'd have a bagel, and then all of a sudden he ends the game with like 8 for 88 and a touchdown. It's just he has that talent. And he had Raiders quarterbacks that were talented enough to throw it to him and get him the ball in spots where he can make plays, but maybe not so talented that they were able to pepper the ball all over the field and spread it around. That's the perfect quarterback that you want for Brock Bowers for fantasy purposes next year if you own him in any of your leagues. Now, let's move on and talk about something that Bill Hollywood was bringing up in the chat room. He says he's going to be going late at tight end in the position and probably nabbing a Chicago tight end, maybe Cole Kmet. Ben Johnson, something that Bill said earlier in the show or in the show chat, he's very bullish on Ben Johnson. I think a lot of people are bullish on Ben Johnson going from Detroit to Chicago. And you say, well, how good, Balky, was Ben Johnson even good? He had Goff, he had St. Brown, he had LaPorta, he had Gibbs, he had Montgomery, he had Jameson Williams, he had all these guys. Well, Chicago, he's going to have DJ Moore. He's going to have Roma Dunze. Cole Kmet is no Sam LaPorta, but he's competent. Focusing on Cole Kmet here, knowing that Johnson's going there and knowing he's a little bit more talented as far as a play caller and maybe a developer of talent than what they had there earlier with Thomas Brown and Shane Waldron, is Ben Johnson giving Cole Kmet owners hope this year that this could be a guy that maybe in a fringe top 10, top 12 guy this season?
Oh, I love it. I mean, Cole Kmet was a top 10 tight end 2 years in a row before this year, and then we saw the offensive line fall apart. Obviously, Keenan Allen comes in, another mouth to feed. And Caleb Williams, they just need to rebuild his confidence. All those sacks he took, sacks are more of a quarterback stat than an offensive line stat, although the line didn't do him any favors either. I would think Cole Kmet's going to be right around tight end 10, 11 in my pre-ranks, and I think he has an excellent chance to outkick his ADP. And look, yeah, did Ben Johnson have good players? Yes, but you could not. I want to know who the great offensive designer is who didn't have great players. You need to have some of those guys. It's
a good point.
I think of, Don Coryell had all those Chargers. Bill Walsh had all those 49ers. Ben Johnson just had all the guys on the Lions that we liked. We talked about Liam Coen. He's going places, tons of talent in that Tampa Bay offensive room. You can't separate those two things. I'm never going to hold that against the players. So I think Cole Kmet, will he smash a league? Will he absolutely wreck your season in a positive way, the way like Bowers did this year, the way that LaPorta did a couple of years ago? That's maybe too big of an ask, but I think he's an excellent chance to be an ADP beater next year because he's already done it. And now we're just asking for an adult in the room in the Chicago offense, and they have that with Ben Johnson.
We've talked a couple of times already about George Kittle and the fantastic season he had this past year. Part of that was, Deebo Samuel dropping passes and maybe Brock Purdy stopped trusting him as much as he did. Maybe some of it was Christian McCaffrey not being available to take a huge share of the workload in that Niners offense. And obviously Brandon Ayuk tearing his ACL did the Niners no favors. But it was great for Kittle's fantasy value. He ends the season with 78 catches, over 1,100 yards, and he gets into the end zone 8 times. The question here is not, can he do it again, Scott? The question here for you is, why won't George Kittle do this again, or at least come close to it in 2025? Fantasy players are drafting him in the Never Too Early Best Ball tournament in the early 4th round as the 3rd tight end off the board behind Bowers, behind McBride. I think they're doing it right. I think that's the way to do it. However, we do have to understand there were some factors that did contribute to Kittle's statistical leap forward last year. And I think that's what we weigh in. We don't want recency bias controlling us here, but we also have to understand this is a super talented player in an offense that really features him quite a bit.
Yeah, and his production the last few years has been pretty stable. He only had that 1 year in 2020 where he missed half the season. For the most part, you're getting 15, 14, 16 games a year. I know it's a high attrition position. Kittle takes a ton of pride in his blocking. He's one of those guys, if you said, look, you're going to block for 3 hours today, he'd be like, fine. Who do you want me to pancake? No problem. But I think he's become more of a floor player than people realize. And because he's capable of scoring from anywhere on the field, we can't say that about too many tight ends, but he does score long touchdowns as well. This year it was more driven by red zone production, but he's dynamite down the seam. Age 32 season, a little bit worrisome for a tight end, but you talked about that early ADP settling into what I think is a reasonable range. If that's going to stick, I'm going to have George Kittle shares in 2025.
Yeah, I think, and the fact that you can get a tight end coming off that season in the 4th round is fantastic. Another tight end, Scott, that is going in the 4th round this year was a guy who was going in the early 2nd last year. Sam LaPorta, his rookie year, was unbelievable. Now, a lot of that was touchdown dependent. We know touchdowns are not the stickiest of stats that you want to go by. And as a result, he did not catch as many touchdowns this year. And he did not really come through with his early 2nd round ADP. However, 408 is where he's going at right now. That is the tight end 4 behind Kittle. He's about a half round behind Kittle right now. Is that more palatable? Is that something that you would be more willing to take a chance on here, the mid 4th round, as opposed to the early 2nd? Or do you think it might still be too high, knowing that Ben Johnson has gone in Detroit as well?
Yeah, I mean, he loses 43 targets from the previous year, but you're a pretty good football player when you're a tight end, 67, 26, and 7, and people are disappointed. People want to know where the production was. That's a heck of a year for most tight ends, and I think that would be a reasonable projection for next year with some upside baked in. Obviously, a new play caller comes in. What kind of player do they get from Jameson Williams next year? Such a talented player, but he does leave a lot of stuff on the field. One thing I never understand with Ben Johnson is why did he have Jameson Williams throwing an option pass against Washington, one of your sketchiest judgment player? He's a super talent, but I don't want Jameson Williams making pocket decisions. And, we know when they call those option passes, usually the guy's going to throw it no matter what. And that was a time where Detroit really needed a touchdown drive. But I would think 7 touchdowns is probably the projection for LaPorta next year, with a decent chance at 8 to 10 if things fall right. We'll see if Tim Patrick has a role in this offense next year, if he's even on the team next year. I still think Goff is who he is. He's a B to B plus. He's never going to be an A. He's not an MVP, but he's good enough. I love playing whenever a player settles into kind of a more boring ADP pocket. He's usually that's a lot of times I'm looking for a value. I'm looking to buy somebody off a slightly disappointing season. Sam LaPorta was still a tight end 6 in most formats last year. I think he's set up. He's not going to smash his ADP, but I think he's set up to at least meet or slightly beat his ADP next year because he slides into that boring ADP pocket.
Yeah, I'm all about boring ADPs because boring ADPs usually make for exciting seasons and fantasy seasons. And if you can collect enough of that, it's really going to help your team go forward into the championship games. Travis Kelce, speaking of championships, he's won a boatload of them with Kansas City, be it division, be it AFCs, be it Super Bowls. He's won a lot of titles. Is this the right year to fade Travis Kelce? I feel like age has been coming up over and over again as a theme on tonight's show, and that's fine because that's something that we need to address. Travis Kelce, I think if you look at the underlying numbers, he had one of his worst years, but somehow turned it on at the playoffs once again. He's been great so far. Is this the right year to fade him? He's going off the board, tight end 6 at the 607. It's the latest, essentially, he's been going since his rookie year. Is that still a fade for you, or would you get on board given that it's just a mid 6th round price tag that's going to cost you to get Kelce on your team?
Well, I'd be worried. Age 35 season this year. What if they win another title? At what point does he think about retiring, right? I mean, he's already in the Hall of Fame. We know what an attrition position tight end is, how many hits you take. And we saw what the Chiefs have done the last couple of years where they've soft pedaled him in the regular season. They turned it on in the playoffs. He was fantastic last year in the playoffs. And we saw him last week dominate against Houston. I don't know how much more. What is there to do if they win a 3rd title in a row? how many more mountains are there to climb? And at what point is it just not worth it to lift all those weights and do all the stuff you have to do off the field when nobody's watching? Muhammad Ali famously said, the battle is won far away from witnesses. At what point do you not want to do that stuff? You want to go live the rest of your life. We've seen his brother, Jason, retire when he was still a really good NFL player because he wanted to do different things with his life, including be on every other commercial, apparently, every other podcast, but which is fine. Hey, if people want you, sign up. Cash the check, nothing wrong with that. But I just don't think Travis Kelce's going to play that much longer. I think he has maybe one season left in him. And if they win a title, I would not be surprised at all if he's retired by a week removed from the season.
Yeah, and that's something I think I guess I failed to consider too. For people drafting right now, you could be sinking in a 6th-round pick on, a Hall of Famer that, almost hit 1,000 yards receiving again this year. But he might be a wasted pick. I mean, he might if they win it, he might just hang it up and call it good, and then that's it. And you're losing a 6th-round pick at that point.
And look at the efficiency stats, right? His yards per target goes down to 6.2 this year. His yards per catch, 8.3. He only caught 3 touchdowns. And I would think next year they're going to have a better wide receiver room, right? I mean, they lost Hollywood Brown as soon as the season started. Next year they'll have a season 2 of Worthy, who's picked it up late in the year. Hopefully we'll have Rashee Rice healthy. He was going to be a right answer. That really stung my season when he got hurt. So even if he does play next year, they're probably going to have the best receiver room that they've had in 3 or 4 seasons.
The player that you talked about that is the true mystery at the position is Jonnu Smith, a guy who's always been athletic. That's been his calling card, right? How much were we complaining when Jonnu Smith was getting all these looks and catches instead of Kyle Pitts in Atlanta in 2023? And then I guess we shouldn't have been surprised in 2024 when he's doing numbers with Miami, catching all these passes over the middle, making plays downfield, down the seam, whatever it is. It's been great. He's been going as tight end 8 ahead of Mark Andrews, behind David Njoku right now, end of the 6th round in the Never Too Early Best Ball tournament. Is that what we're supposed to do with him? Are we supposed to take him at that 6-7 turn, Scott, and tight end premium scoring?
The thing is, I can't say there's a floor with Jonnu Smith, but I want to point out a couple of things. I mean, he had 8 touchdowns this year. He had an 8-touchdown season with Tennessee. He averaged 8 yards a target this year, which is great. He was actually at 8.3 yards a target last year with Atlanta with not that less volume. He had 70 targets, he had 50 catches. And we know Arthur Smith was making us pull our hair out and all that stuff. But I think Jonnu Smith has always been a good player who just hasn't found the right situation. He's always been part of, a 2 tight end offense, a Patriot offense that shuttled guys in and out. He goes to Atlanta where there's a Kyle Pitts who's there, taking up space, and an offense that maybe didn't have the right pieces, they didn't have the right quarterback, all that stuff. So I just wish Jonnu Smith was 26 or 27. The fact that he's stepping into his age 30 season makes me a little bit nervous. Here's the thing. If I have a roster where I've built in, I think, a lot of floor, a lot of players who I think have really, safe ranges of outcome, I'm more willing to take on some of the risk of a Jonnu Smith because of the format. It's obviously tight end centric. And I know that the floor that Smith doesn't have, it's not going to affect me because I've addressed that the last 3 or 4 picks. So my roster build and how much floor and upside I think I've balanced out when I get to a Smith pick is probably going to be the determination of whether or not I pull the trigger. I'm intrigued by what they've uncovered. And I think McDaniel's a smart enough guy that I think there's some of this genie out of the bottle. You can't put it back in. This is a really and just a destructive player who can beat you on the seam, who can make a really quick decisive availability throw for Tua. We need guys like that, right? We need to know where the ball's going quickly after the snap when your quarterback is somebody you don't want to take deep drops to. Jonnu Smith really fits the scope of this offense right now. So I think he's going to be a polarizing player in the draft season. I feel like I'm more pro Smith than anti Smith as we start uncovering these 2025 questions.
I don't, and maybe I missed it if you said it, Scott, but Jonnu Smith, it seems I always thought he was an older guy. He turns 30 in August.
Yep.
So he's still in his 20s right now. And I think a tight end, I mean, is that the most, I mean, we'll talk about age with quarterbacks in the next segment, but I mean, is that the most forgiving position? If you're going to be 30 plus, is a tight end. I feel like that position, if you play it well enough, like Kelsey does, you can, that papers over a lot of the shortcomings you get as you hit that age 30 threshold.
A lot of the great tight ends, and maybe it's a mistake to put Smith in this category, but Gronk aged really well. Kellen Winslow, senior, aged well. Gonzalez aged well. Kelsey has obviously been great all into his mid-30s. Kittle just had a monster year, age 31, age 32, whatever it was. So a lot of these guys do age. We have to take consideration of what their ages are, but it's tight end is usually a position where we give them a couple of years to figure it out. We've been spoiled last year because LaPorta and Bowers hit the ground running, but this is a position where I think the age, the early 30s, isn't as penal for a tight end as it might be for some of the other field players.
It was, I don't want to say a tale of two halves for Mark Andrews, but Scott, going into the October 13th game for Mark Andrews against the Washington Commanders, he had the Ravens had 5 games under their belt. Mark Andrews was sitting at 10 catches for 120 yards and no touchdowns on the season, including, and maybe, I can't remember, maybe he didn't play against the Cowboys and Bills, but took zeros in those games. After that, it was a different story because he ended up going on a tight end rampage. 2 weeks for the remainder of the season, he didn't score. Think about that. Week 5, no touchdowns. The remaining 12 weeks, he scored every single week except for 2. He finishes the season with 55 catches, 673 yards, and 11 touchdowns. The Andrews second half, is that unsustainable? Probably from a touchdown perspective. But when you look at getting him as the tight end 9 in the mid-7th round of the Never Too Early tournament, I mean, to me, I'm on board. Lamar Jackson, that offense, sure. I can get on board with Mark Andrews after the top 8 guys are off the board. Give me him in the mid-7th. How do you feel about him there?
Yeah, he's a tough guy, man. 11 touchdowns on 55 catches on 69 targets. Is Zay Flowers ever going to start getting the touchdowns that should be commensurate with his ability? What have they uncovered with Bateman, who had a quasi-breakout year? Obviously, Isaiah Likely is a very talented player who's a kind of a quasi-tight end, one of those hybrid players. My heart also just goes out to Andrews. I mean, he's getting, I think, far too much blame for Baltimore's failure to beat Buffalo. Football is a team game. They left a lot of points on the field for a lot of different reasons. And even the ball that he doesn't catch on the 2-pointer, I mean, he's up against the pylon. He's up against the boundary. It's an awkward position to be catching the ball. You're bracing yourself for a hit. I don't know. Mark Andrews is a good guy in my book, but I'm just afraid that he's going to have like 85 targets, and I don't know what is realistic for his volume. So I'd like to have somebody who I can tell myself a story. And I realized it wasn't that long ago he was getting 100, 120, even 150 targets one year, but I'm just afraid he's more in the 75 to 90 target range. And I think that caps his upside.
Mark Andrews, to me, has always been an easy guy to root for. A guy who he'll turn 30, I think week 1 of the 2025 season. So he's still 29 too. But he's an easy guy to root for. I remember back on Hard Knocks a few years ago when he's talking about because he has diabetes and how he's got to, check his blood sugar every time he comes off the. I mean, I think about everything that you have to deal with that. I'm a Brewers fan too, Scott. Garrett Mitchell, center fielder. He's had to deal with that his whole life. And you think about everything pro athletes have to handle with their bodies, and then you throw this diabetes thing at, like, it's wild. And the other Andrews thing I always bring up with people since that drop, let's say he catches it. It's a tie game. Mm-hmm. You're giving Josh Allen like 100 seconds and all he needs is a field goal. I mean, I'm not convinced that the Bills just don't. But Buffalo's
still the favorite to win that game, even if they tie the score, for sure.
And it wasn't, and I think that's a lot of people are looking at like, oh, Andrews choked or whatever. Well, I mean, yeah, it was bad, but it wasn't the easiest catch in the world, and I don't know if it lost the game. So that's my 2 cents on that.
And you're talking, by the way, great diabetic athletes. I mean, I think back to Bobby Clark, 3-time MVP of the Philadelphia Flyers, Bobby Jones, Hall of Famer, NBA, one of the all-time best defensive players. I mean, guys who are able to beat obstacles off the field. And Mark Andrews, the way he handled it, I realized he didn't want to talk the day of the game and everything, but he came out and gave, I thought, a very reasonable answer, and I think people should be fine with that, man. These people are human beings. They want to win as badly. I mean, Baltimore, it's a tough story because they've had so much success Maybe Lamar Jackson's going to win his third MVP. They haven't had the success in the playoffs. It's just so hard to win. There's so many, Eric, I'm old enough to remember when Dan Marino went to the Super Bowl in his second year. And if you had told me Dan Marino would have a relatively healthy career from that point forward, would set all kinds of records, would never get back to the Super Bowl, I'd be like, you're crazy. Yeah. Or, how does Aaron Rodgers not get back a second time? How does Drew Brees not get back a second time? It's hard.
Yeah.
And so many things, officiating calls, missed kicks, weather, the way the ball bounces sometimes. It just, it's unfair. Football is the ultimate team game, and it's just unfair sometimes that we pin it all on one guy. And as you said, so what if he catches a 2-pointer? Maybe Josh Allen goes right down the field. Tyler Bass makes a field goal, and we're not even talking about it.
We're not even talking about it. That's a great point. And the other thing with Andrews too, with that, this is how he's dialed in as far as managing that diabetes. It has never come up in fantasy discussions or anything. Like, you never worry because he has a handle on it, and it's never going to affect the way he plays the game. So shout out to Mark Andrews, and shout out to the Bills, by the way. Did a great job of donating, I don't know how many tens of thousands of dollars to Mark Andrews charity after, he was getting death threats or whatever, the way he was treated after dropping that pass. Kudos to the Bills too, for coming through. I looked at your top rankings for tight ends for 2025, your early top, I think it was top 10 or top 12. I can't remember, but I did notice that Tucker Kraft made that list at number 7. Tucker Kraft is a guy that, has had an interesting professional career. Drafted in the 3rd round of the same draft where the Packers use a 2nd-round pick on Luke Musgrave. Kraft dealt with, I believe, a torn pec this past offseason. Didn't really miss much time. Played through some pain this year and got it done. I don't think he is, quote-unquote, as athletic as Luke Musgrave. I do believe he plays the tight end position overall significantly better than Luke Musgrave. I think Musgrave does a couple of things that Kraft doesn't do as well or at all, but Kraft is still the guy that you want out there. And in several games this year, when Jaden Reed couldn't get open against man coverage, when Christian Watson was dropping passes, when Romeo Doubs was not getting it done, Tucker Kraft always seemed to come through when Jordan Love needed him. They've designed plays for Kraft as well. And I do think he has a better 2025 season than 2024, which was still very good. But I still was surprised to see him as high as 7th in your rankings. You're very excited about Tucker Kraft this year, maybe even more so than me, a Packers fan.
Yeah, I'm a Tucker Kraft guy for 2 reasons. One, I love the goal line equity. And also, Matt LaFleur loves to dial up the screen game for Tucker Kraft. A bunch of 20-plus receptions where it's those interior screens or just the wide-out screen, get those blockers out in front. So they love his catch-after ability, what he brings. It's really hard to figure out. And I'm speaking to a Packer fan. You know this better than anybody else. I mean, the rotation in that receiver room, it's hard to know where the snaps coming from, where the routes coming from, where the targets coming from. But Kraft was somebody who I thought was pretty stable week over week. I think he's passed Musgrave as far as the upside tight end in this offense. I think next year he has 6 to 8 touchdowns already in his back pocket, and I can see him maybe averaging 15 yards a catch.
I think I don't want to say the sky's the limit because you do have some other talented pass catchers on that offense. And, oh, by the way, they're probably going to get somebody else via trade, free agency, or in the draft that's going to factor into that wide receiver core next year as well. So, and if Musgrave's healthy, I mean, that takes away a little bit from Kraft too. But when he's running hot, and he doesn't even have to run that hot too, given what you said about what LaFleur does with him when he's on the field, you know that he's going to get involved in the game. There is something to like about Kraft. And it could be a guy that, he's not being drafted amongst the top 9 tight ends right now in the Never Too Early tournament. Could be a guy that we saw it in 2024, and people might still be sleeping on him a little bit in 2025, and he could finish as a top 5 tight end. You never know.
Totally sign off. He's the most underrated tight end of the top 10 on the board right now for my money.
The last thing I want to bring up in regards to the tight ends is this. Let me bring you back to early September of 2024 with the ADP and the FFPC main event featuring Dalton Kincaid at the 208 as tight end 4 and Kyle Pitts at the 404 as the tight end 7. These guys are not going in the top 7 rounds of the Never Too Early Best Ball tournament right now. And for different reasons, but the biggest reason is we just didn't see it from these guys this past year. Who's a better investment for 2025? If I have to narrow it down between one of these two players, Scott, who are you more likely to draft? Is it Dalton Kincaid in Buffalo, or is it Kyle Pitts in Atlanta this season?
I think I'll probably be underweight on both of them, but at least I can tell myself with Pitts, he's only age 25 season, and they have finally, we would hope to think, a competent quarterback, because Cousins was not that guy, and Cousins was better than the stuff that they had the previous seasons. Maybe Zach Robinson is a better play caller in his second season. It took a while for him to kind of get his feet wet. We can at least remember, close our eyes and remember that one great Penix throw that he threw to Pitts and the touchdown in that great game against Washington, that really tight window throw. And Kincaid, I'm just worried, man. There's so many receivers there, and so much of their touchdowns are going to be gobbled up by the running backs, and then you get to give 8 to 12 to Josh Allen, and even their backup running backs are pretty good. I can't draft Kincaid proactively. I can't draft Pitts proactively, but at least I can tell myself a more plausible upside story with Pitts, because there are things changing in Atlanta that may be to his benefit.
Yeah, I think that's the key is knowing that. Well, you know, and here's the thing. I know Kyle Pitts is polarizing every single year, but I've always been able to, and maybe I'm a Pitts apologist and I'm not willing to admit it, but I've always made an excuse for him every single year, right? And now the excuse I can make is now Penix throwing to him instead of Kirk Cousins. When it comes down to it, it kind of depends upon how everybody else in my draft is treating him. If I'm able to get him as a fringe top 12 option with that kind of athleticism, knowing that it won't cost me, it won't burn me to sink a lesser draft capital into him this year, then yes, I will take the chance on Pitts. However, if I'm going to have that one guy in my league this year again that just loves Pitts more than anybody else, then yeah, I'm not going to go crazy on him. In regards to Kincaid, we saw it at the end of the 2023 season. What happened in 2024 where, Cooper hasn't made a huge impact? Keon Coleman didn't really make a huge impact. You have Khalil Shakir really as the best pass catcher in Buffalo. What happened this season that's prevented Kincaid from taking that sophomore leap that we see from so many tight ends, Scott?
I wish I had a great answer. And by the way, Dalton Kincaid's sneaky old. Next year is his age 26 season. So
wow.
If it's going to happen for Dalton Kincaid, I'm ready for it, man. And, I'm dying to throw those Ruben Kincaid shots out, Partridge Family.
Yes.
I thought it was going to be, I had Kincaid shares this year. I thought he was going to have, think of what Sam LaPorta did this year. I thought that what Kincaid was going to do, like the 750 yards and the 7 touchdowns. We got nothing close to that. And Buffalo, they're happy with the rotation. They're not forcing the ball to anybody. Even Shakir, as great as he's been, there's going to be games that he has 3 to 5 targets. And so I need to tell myself a story of this guy's a priority. And I don't see that they've done anything with Kincaid that makes me feel that that's how they view him.
I'm looking at this right now. I just hear that, okay, this is going to be his age 26 season. I immediately think, okay, he's from out west. He played at Utah, clearly a Mormon, right? And would there some sort of mission? I don't see any Mormon mission that he was on. I don't know why he's as old as he is. I mean, he had one season that was shortened because of COVID. But I don't understand why he is that old. That's just crazy to me. And maybe I need to get off the Kincaid train, obviously, at this point. If maybe he's just missed that development that he was going to hit. And well, I guess it all depends upon where he goes. It's the same thing with Pitts. Everything is relative, Scott, when it comes to where these guys are going in drafts. The last thing I want to bring, no, that was the last thing I wanted to bring up. Okay, so let's do this. Let's step out and take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about what we learned in 2024 for quarterbacks. We're going to talk about the ascendance of Jayden Daniels and how you need to treat him in drafts. We're going to talk about Sam Darnold and how we weigh his last 2 games of the season versus the rest of the body of work. And we're going to talk about a theory I have on Patrick Mahomes, why he is not going to be elite again next year. He's Scott Pianowski from Yahoo. I'm Eric Balkman from the FFPC. You're watching the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show on the Better Sports Network.
World champion Ric Flair once said, if you want to be the man, you got to beat the man. And if you want to be the man or woman this fantasy football season, you got to play over at myffpc.com. That's where all the best fantasy gamers play. That's where all the high stakes gamers play. because they've got the high stakes leagues. They have the best formats. They have the best payouts. It's the place to be. And if you win a FFPC main event or a Fantasy Pros Championship contest over there, you put some serious respect on your name and some money in your pocket. Anyone can win their hometown league, right? You're probably a great fantasy gamer. Prove it. You go out and win an event like this, you can go and put in your Twitter bio or X bio, FFPC.
Talk about utilizing something called
champion. That means something. That's definitive proof that you're one of the best fantasy gamers in the world. So go over to myffpc.com and use promo code COOP. They'll give you $25 when you deposit $35 or more. And now you're on your road to greatness, right? You could even do an online draft, or you can go and draft in Las Vegas with the stars. Draft at Planet Hollywood for the FFPC main event. That's where they're all doing it. It's awesome stuff. So get set up now so that you can be a star this year. You can be the man. Just like Ric Flair, you can be a champion. Woo!
Reloading to ensure something called a permanent championship window with FFPC Dynasty Leagues. How do we make sure that perpetual reloading is what we're doing in our rookie drafts every year to make sure that we're always competing for titles year in and year out?
Yeah, so we always have this tension between playing a little bit for the future and playing for the present. You'll have drafters jump into the startup. They'll draft the veterans. They're trying to win in that first year. Sometimes they do. I don't want to in any way, shape, or form suggest that that doesn't work, because you see some of those teams compete and win titles. And yet, when we're thinking about the best way to control your chances to win, you want to be in the playoffs year after year. You want your championship window to always be open. You don't want to get to a point where you build, and then have a couple of years where you're going for it and then you're rebuilding again. You want to be in it every year. You want to get as many buys as possible so you don't have to compete in that quarterfinal round. You build a more powerful team. You can't control the injury that you have to the key player that cost you a title, or the 50-point game that a non-elite player like an Amari Cooper scores and knocks you out. You can control having one of the best teams every single season. The way that you do that is you build depth in your player talent across all those positions. You build depth in your picks. In order to execute some of those types of things, you trade down, you trade peak players, you trade young players. You've got to trade things that people want. A lot of times I think when people are trying to reload or rebuild, they're trying to trade distressed assets at a level that the rest of the group isn't interested in, and then you feel like you can't move. If you're going to make trades, you've got to trade things that people want. You can also trade 2-for-1.
We are 27 minutes past the top of the hour here on the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show on the Better Sports Network. I'm Eric Balkman. He is Scott Pianowski from Yahoo Fantasy Sports, talking there with Sean Siegel from RotoViz about Dynasty Leagues. And if you're looking to pick up a Dynasty League, myffpc.com is where to go to pick up your orphans. Right now, they range in price from $77 all the way up to $5,000. Many of those prices have actually been discounted for 2025. So get in while the getting's good and play fantasy football 365 days a year. Those are dynasty leagues, but don't forget about the never too early best ball tournaments that are going on over at the FFPC as well. For $35, you can enter the Superflex Never Too Early tournament and win a $10,000 grand prize. A $200 entry fee gets you into the Never Too Early best ball tournament, where we have a $40,000 grand prize. Last year was $25,000. It is up to $40,000 this year. You can play with a 30-second, 60-second, 2-hour, or 6-hour clock. Check it out, myffpc.com, myffpc.com. Scott, let's talk about quarterbacks. And the first question I'm going to ask you is obviously about the age. We talked about these wide receivers that have moved past their age 30 season. We talked about tight ends once they get into their early 30s. Well, let's talk about quarterbacks, because I feel like there was a trend in the NFL not too long ago, especially with the Russell Wilson and Aaron Rodgers trades, where NFL teams, not all of them, most of them seem to believe you cannot win unless you have a franchise quarterback, and they were willing to give up a boatload to get him. Denver getting Denver getting Russell Wilson from Seattle. The Jets getting Aaron Rodgers from Green Bay. And yet, what have we seen? Didn't exactly work out in those two spots. Wilson has moved on to Pittsburgh, and Aaron Rodgers expected to move on from the Jets. Should we be wary about drafting quarterbacks above the age of 30? Or is that too young? Should we not be concerned with them? I think what goes into this too, and this is something that you wrote about for Yahoo, is you like these running quarterbacks, but they have to be able to do more than simply just run the football.
Yeah, certainly. It has to garnish your game. It can't be the entree. Jackson had his best season, Lamar Jackson, because he developed so much as a passer, 41 touchdown passes, 4 interceptions. And, as much of a dynamic runner as Jayden Daniels is, it's built off the foundation that he can shred you with his arm, and he can make every throw. And so much of the right answer of Jayden Daniels was the wrong answer of Anthony Richardson, who's an athlete, who's a runner, who still can't throw the ball. His completion percentage belongs in a time of football that's like 30 or 40 years removed. So it's going to be something that you do to add to your value, but it can't be the main thing. Now, I'm really curious to see what's going to happen when Jackson, when Allen, when Mahomes, when a lot of these heyday quarterbacks, Joe Burrow, what happens when they get in their 30s? Because this year it was a very bad season for quarterbacks into their 30s. Goff turned 30, I think, in the middle of the season. He had a perfectly fine season, but it was a bad year for Wilson. It was a bad year for Rodgers. It was a bad year for Kirk Cousins, who may never be a starter again. And I talked earlier on the show about how I'm trying to trend younger at positions. Tight end may be a position that maybe the guys age gracefully, but I would like younger receivers. I would like younger running backs. I know it wasn't a great rookie running back class, but still, I want my running backs who haven't had. Ideally, I want these players who haven't had their best season yet. And, I think I was willing to. I think quarterback is still a position you can do well at a price point, but I don't want the days of I'll just get a Dak Prescott, a Kirk Cousins. I'll get the unsexy 32 touchdowns, 4,100 yards. I don't think that's a viable strategy the way maybe it was 5 years ago.
Interesting. The chat is fired up right now talking about Jayden Daniels, Tom Szymanski. JD5 is him, and then Tom Smith chimes in. Could you guys see Jayden Daniels going as quarterback 3 overall behind Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson? Well, Tom, not only can I see it, that's exactly what's happening in the Never Too Early Best Ball tournament right now. Jayden Daniels is the 3rd quarterback on average off the board, going at the 403 behind Allen and behind Jackson. I will say this about Daniels. He is so much fun to watch. I have never seen, ever, any rookie quarterback, I don't care who it was, pick your Hall of Famer, sustain drives the way that Daniels does, picking up 3rd and 4th downs as if he's just taking a breath and letting it out. It's just a bodily function for him. I've never seen any rookie quarterback do that, and he's doing it like every game. My concern with Daniels is I saw Jordan Love go on quite the heater last year, where he was playing right up there at the best quarterbacks in football. I thought it was unfair to him because I don't think he's that good. I mean, I think he's good. I don't think he's that good. And to see what he did this year did not surprise me to see him take a step back. Now, in the grand scheme of things, Scott, I believe Daniels is more talented than Jordan Love. Heaters like this are probably going to happen more with Daniels. That said, I don't necessarily want to draft him as the 3rd quarterback off the board based on what I'm seeing right now and what I saw basically for the entire month of December. However, if that's not the case, if this is just who he is, then yeah, sign me up for Jayden Daniels. Is it too early to take him as the 3rd quarterback off the board in the early 4th round in these 2025 drafts right now?
Yeah, I think that's a fair ADP for him. It's probably not going to be the way I'm going to approach the quarterback position. I just think the position is deep enough. I mean, the idea is to get this year's Jayden Daniels to try to find a player like that next year, right? Jayden Daniels was anywhere from quarterback 8 to quarterback 13, depending on when you drafted last year, and he easily outkicked. And again, I thought plenty of things I got wrong last year, but one thing I did get right is that the Anthony Richardson stuff, I'm like, okay, everything you're saying about Anthony Richardson, you should be applying to Jayden Daniels. You can get him several rounds later, and neatly that worked out. We don't have enough time to go through all the stuff I got wrong because this is only a 2-hour program. But I want to find maybe Jared Goff is really affordable next year because Ben Johnson's gone. I realize Goff doesn't have a running component. Bo Nix was somebody at times who was able to run. I think they're going to add maybe an impact tight end next year or running back. They still don't have the offense that Sean Payton wants. They're probably a year ahead of schedule. Sam Darnold land somewhere? Can we trust him? He did a lot of really good things. We all get throw all of that out the window because he didn't play well the last 2 weeks of the season. If Justin Herbert got another impact receiver, he'd be interesting. Brock Purdy has a lot of help in San Francisco. Geno Smith was a passable quarterback this year. Caleb Williams, do we talk ourselves into him next year with Ben Johnson? Still a lot of talent in that offensive room. I just feel like you can do – I've often talked about drafting quarterbacks like it's like the public transit system in New York. You miss a bus, another bus is coming in 5 minutes. You miss a train, another train's coming in 5 minutes. So if I could pick my price on Jayden Daniels, if I'm in a room where he oddly slips a half round or a round, I'm willing to be proactive there. But I just feel like there's going to be reasonable answers, upside answers at so many different price points that I'm not going to target him as much as I love him as a player. And it's just a fun story. And like a lot of people, I would, if they get to the Super Bowl, I think it'd be fantastic. So much of being great at quarterback is the heart rate, is the calm in all elements. The game's never fast for him. We saw him adjust. He had a rib injury earlier, middle of the year, I guess it was. He was reluctant to run for about a month. That's where his slump came in. Also, teams maybe had more tape on him and stuff like that. But he had answers when he got healthy again. Obviously, the way they've played the last few weeks, it's been fantastic. And just the game he never looks harried. He's always poised in the pocket, and he's able to make great throws with bodies around him, right? He's able to throw off platform. He's able to throw on the run. He's able to throw stepping up. He's able to throw right, before he takes that step over the line of scrimmage. And I just can't wait. I just wish the guy great health. We saw this 12 years ago, right? With RG3. I think Jayden Daniels is a better player than RG3, another Heisman Trophy winner, but Washington had hope. Washington had a playoff bid, and it looked like everything was turning around, and then Griffin got hurt. I just wish Jayden Daniels all the health in the world, because I can't wait to see where the next 10 years go. That said, I think I'll be underweight on him next year.
I think we're always looking for, especially if in single quarterback leagues where you're waiting on quarterback after 9-10 of them are off the board. And then I always do the quarterback bang, bang, where I'll get 2 of them right.
Yes.
I love that. 11 and 12 quarterbacks off the board, 12th and 13th. And then I don't worry about it for the rest of the draft.
That's such a great play. If you're the last one to take one, be the first one to take the second one.
Exactly. Yeah. And Andrew Cooper, who we saw in various breaks through this broadcast tonight, he's the one who always likes to do the yin and yang tight end. And I think you can do it at quarterback too, where those 2 bang bang guys, one's a high floor guy, the other's a high ceiling guy, right?
Love it.
And if the high ceiling guy pans out, hey, you're all set. But if he doesn't, you got a high floor guy. You didn't sink a whole lot of draft capital into the high ceiling guy, and you could go diving on the waiver wire to try to figure out what you're going to do with your.
That's such a great nuance of how the upside and floor personalities of your players mix together, and how if you're like making a cocktail, right? You need a dash of this and you need a dash of that, and even though the 2 tastes might be contrary, they mix together on a roster construction that makes sense.
Yeah, if you're getting a Jack and Coke, you don't want it all Jack. That's going to be way too strong, way too bitter. But you don't want it to be all Coke either, because then it's going to be too sweet and you don't get that punch, that buzz you're looking for. So, yeah, I think that's the cocktail analogy.
Or try Jack with 7-Up. You might be surprised at how good.
No, I have done that. I have a buddy, his father-in-law swears, he says the only man's drink is Jack Daniels and lemonade. He's always drinking Jack and lemonade. I don't get it. I tried it. It's good. But it's not something I want to drink all the time.
It sounds like an Arnold Palmer, effective drink, maybe
with whiskey, essentially. Yeah.
Right.
Let's talk about Joe Burrow here, who is going as quarterback 5, Scott, right now at the end of the 4th round. I can't remember which Bengals beat writer talked about this, but Burrow was talking about Tee Higgins after a game this year. And he talked about how important Higgins was to the offense and how he was going to make sure that Higgins was a Bengal in 2025. And the beat writer said, Burrow's very calculated when it comes to what he says after games. If he comes out and says something like this, it's meaningful. And he's going to make sure that this happens. Obviously, he can redo his contract to make sure that they can bring Higgins back. The thing that concerns me about Higgins is he plays for the Bengals, a team that is notoriously cheap, I would say, with a lot of players. Sure. So that gives me concern. If he leaves, I don't think Jermaine Burton is that guy. I don't think Andre Yoshavash is that guy. So if if that's the case and Higgins moves on, is Burrow going to pay off at quarterback 5 when it's just him and Jamar Chase next year, and then these other complementary pieces, but ain't nobody Tee Higgins on that roster besides Tee Higgins?
Yeah, to see the carnival in full effect, you need an impact player in the vein of Higgins, whether it's Higgins or not. And man, Joe Burrow, man, talk about a guy who won me over for life with that Heisman speech. We talked about how much fun that LSU team was, and this organization, right? I mean, they were penny wise and pound foolish with Chase. They may regret how they've handled the Higgins situation. They have Burrow in their corner, and he's going to do everything he can to kick the can down the road with his own contract. But I don't know if they can find a way to keep Higgins happy. But what a fun, what a perfect carnival, right? I mean, the defense couldn't stop anybody. They had a very concentrated offense, which is about 2 dynamic receivers, 1 running back who took off. Chase Brown was one of the most impactful picks you could have made this year. I was underweight on Brown, and that really hurt because he was, for 2 months, was just an absolute monster. He's like practically like Christian McCaffrey, for crying out loud, and they couldn't stop anybody. But Burrow needs that. And as great as Burrow is, I need to have a second receiver. I feel very strongly about for him to have an ADP that I could justifiably punch on. So if Higgins isn't there, I realize there'll be other guys will be traded. They could draft people. I agree with you. I don't think the receivers they have in house have that much upside. I need to see that second pitch for me to justify the ADP ticket on Burrow right now.
And so you're willing to let the Burrow bus go by because you know there's going to be another bus coming. And the bus that is coming right after Joe Burrow, according to the ADP in the FFPC Never Too Early Best Ball Tournament, is one Patrick Mahomes, quarterback 6 at the 602. I have a theory on Mahomes, and I think we've seen it happen this year, and I think we've seen it happen last year as well. You talk about how good the Bengals' bad defense was for Joe Burrow, for Chase, for Higgins, for Chase Brown, all those guys. That's what made that Bengals offense so much fun. The fantasy carnival, as it were. Patrick Mahomes doesn't have that. He has a really good defense in Kansas City, and he has a ground game with Isaiah Pacheco and Kareem Hunt that's been above average this year as well. I'm wondering if the Chiefs are just simply too good of a franchise, too good of a team, too well run for Mahomes to ever get back to like top 2 or top 3 quarterbacks. The defense has to get much worse. The team has to be run more poorly, for lack of a better term, for him to be doing video game numbers again. I feel like Kansas City is just at this point, they're just too good of an organization, too good of a team for Mahomes to ascend that high. Am I on the right track? Or am I off here at all? How do you feel about it?
It's totally reasonable. I mean, they never scored more than 30 points this year, right? Where are the 44-41 games? You just not pressed into that type of activity. Mahomes into an age 30 season. I do think his receiver room is going to be better than it's been in a while next year, assuming good health. And there are some guys that they have to figure out who they're going to bring back and all that stuff. But your defense can be too good. Your offense can be too balanced. And they've been, you look at their wins this year, just a lot of 21-17s and a lot of 20-13s. And they've had Kansas City's script so often is, okay, we're not going to make the mistake. It's going to be the other team missing the kick, the other team taking the penalty, the other team dropping the ball at the wrong time. Belichick, Parcells, Bob Knight, they've always said for years, games are more lost than they are won. The teams that make fewer mistakes, the teams that win. And that's been Kansas City's ethos. If I were drafting first overall in the NFL, I still might take Patrick Mahomes, but he is not in the right setup for it. And also he's a proactive runner. He's a resourceful runner, but he's never going to have that 700, 800, 900 yard rushing season that some of these guys have. He's never going to have double-digit rushing touchdowns. He's just not wired that way. The offense, it wasn't that long ago that he got hurt on a quarterback sneak. They generally don't like to overexpose him in that part of the game. So you try to tell people who are new to fantasy, the NFL is all about the quarterback. Fantasy isn't necessarily all about the quarterback. Right. The NFL is all about Patrick Mahomes. Fantasy football hasn't been about Patrick Mahomes. I mean, he wasn't even really a top 10 quarterback this year. He was actually a net loss, depending on where you picked him in fantasy this year. And next year, I think there's going to be a lot of drafts where he goes a round or two later than he should. And you're going to be thinking, he's Patrick Mahomes. He's Patrick Mahomes. He's Andy Reid. And I still don't think I'm going to pull the trigger.
I think that high stakes players are, and fantasy football players in general, I think got a lot of things right with ADP last year. I think they're pretty sharp, and knowing that, it's going to be very interesting to see how his ADP looks now in January compared to what it'll look like in March, compared to what it'll look like in May, and then July, and then September. To see the adjustment of that throughout the summer is going to be something we'll be paying attention to for sure. The guy after him, quarterback 7 in ADP right now, going at the 604, not just a couple of picks behind Mahomes, is one Jared Goff. Jared Goff this year had a 5 interception game. He had, was it 3 or 4 picks that he threw against the Commanders? I mean, it was multiple picks again. What did we learn about Jared Goff, not only this season, but the Commanders game? Is that just a one-off? Are we throwing that out? I think that I never like to, even because playoffs are obviously magnified just in general. I don't want to just throw it out because it was a game, but I don't want to give too much credence to it. And then the other thing we have to consider in drafting Jared Goff in 2025, based on what we learned in 2024, was how integral was Ben Johnson in having a great relationship with him. We heard, Scott, that he would just throw out plays that Goff didn't like. Like, he tailored everything to what Goff could do, what he was comfortable with. And we call Goff a button pusher for a reason. Like, Ben Johnson always gave him a good keyboard to push the right buttons, which Goff did a lot. And he was awesome. What did we learn about him if we look at the whole season last year in how we treat him for this upcoming season's drafts?
Yeah, no matter what they do with the play calling, I'm still willing to be proactive with Goff because St. Brown, LaPorta, Jamison Williams, Jahmyr Gibbs, they are all front 9 players. They are all arrow ascending players. And man, one mistake I do think Ben Johnson made, by the way, why are you starting David Montgomery and giving Montgomery as much of a share? I love David Montgomery, but Jahmyr Gibbs just can't be defended right now. And I think putting Gibbs on the bench in the first series of the game was a big mistake. Granted, they probably needed to score 40-plus points to win that game because the defense was so beat up and Washington was doing whatever they could. I also wonder, and I feel uncomfortable really speculating about this stuff, but Goff took that heavy hit on the interception. It's fair to wonder if he was physically compromised and they were maybe even scheming away from that in the second half. But because so many pieces around Goff that aren't going anywhere are still on the front 9, still ascending players, I can't see how he wouldn't be a top 10 quarterback next year. Now, he probably doesn't, without the running ability, can't be quarterback 1, quarterback 2, quarterback 3, something like that. But I think Goff's going to be priced where you get your ADP back, and maybe there's even a little bit room of profit. There's just too many talented players around him, and also a schedule that will be heavy on indoor games. We know he's generally played better at home than on the road. Mm-hmm. It's a lot of high-scoring games are possible in that division, which is only 6 games. But I think the Lions are still going to play plenty of pinball in 25.
He went from quarterback 15 in ADP last year to quarterback 7 this year. He went as a mid-13th round pick last year to a mid-6th round pick this year. It is quite the jump for Jared Goff. Warranted? Possibly. We'll see what happens with Detroit. And I'm very interested to see who they hire as an offensive coordinator. I understand when you have that talent on the offense, maybe it doesn't make as big of a deal as it might make for another team, but still going to be very interested to see what Dan Campbell does there for sure. Bo Nix, I meant to bring this up when we were talking about Patrick Mahomes because somebody in the chat, maybe I don't have it anymore. No, it's right there. Tom Smith. He said he probably would rather have Bo Nix than Patrick Mahomes in 2025. And Nix is a guy who's still doing it with his legs. Nix is a guy who carried that team for stretches this season, made Troy Franklin look pretty good, made Marvin Mims look pretty good. Cortland Sutton was definitely relevant for a second straight year coming off a 10-touchdown season. Nix, again, he was an older quarterback, more seasoned, more experienced than a lot of rookie quarterbacks. So I think that plays into it as well. But I noticed in your quarterback rankings this year, Scott, you have Nix as a top 10 option as well.
Yeah, excited. Sean Payton, decent pieces around him. I think they will add, whether it's an impact receiver, maybe an impact tight end. It's a really good tight end class. That's a position they could use. And maybe they even find somebody they can settle on in the backfield. Nix is, again, athletic, can run, doesn't have to make that the centerpiece of his fantasy value or his NFL value. And maybe coming into the league at an advanced stage, he went to Auburn, he bounced around, he ended up at Oregon. And the whole thing with Oregon was like, oh, well, all those horizontal passes, can he throw downfield? Can he really be a pocket guy? And I mean, that we saw that answered really quickly. Bo Nix was ahead of schedule. And Sean Payton getting a quarterback he believes in. Cortland Sutton, much like Terry McLaurin, as a receiver I've always believed in. Just wanted to see him with a better magic quarterback. I feel like he has that now. I think the Broncos will be back in the playoffs next season, and I think Bo Nix will be obviously a huge part of that. And he's somebody I could draft proactively in 25.
Could have 3 AFC West teams in the playoffs again next year. Broncos, Chargers, and Chiefs all made it this year. Maybe that happens again next year because all 3 of those teams, the Chiefs aren't on the rise. You can't really be on the rise when you're sitting at the mountaintop for 2 straight years. But definitely the Chargers on the rise, Broncos on the rise as well. Ben Johnson, getting back to him, Scott, this guy was one of the most popular head coaching candidates in not only 2024, but 2023 as well. He turned down offers. It looked like he was going to be the next Commanders head coach until he took his name out of the running and said, no, I'm good here in Detroit. This was a situation where Johnson could have had his pick of the litter last year, could have had his pick of the litter this year. He picked the Chicago Bears. He picked a team that has a quarterback who went with the first overall pick of the 2024 draft, a possible generational talent, a guy who showed us flashes last year, but never really had that consistency. Part of that was him learning. Part of it was his offensive line. Is Ben Johnson the guy that is going to make Caleb Williams from average NFL rookie to superstar? Is he that? Because again, I just look at it from the standpoint of like, Johnson could have gone pretty much anywhere. He held out, and this is the job he took in Chicago. How excited should we be about drafting Bears in 2025?
Yeah, I think excited. I mean, it still blows my mind that after getting the first pick, getting Caleb Williams, and Williams is a weird player. I mean, he wins the Heisman, then he gets worse his final year at USC, comes to Chicago, and Shane Waldron is the best offensive coordinator they could get, who was basically hustled out of Seattle. And the Bears, a lot of times with their hiring decisions, do some really strange things. But this year, they're buying from the top of the market. They're getting the offensive coordinator everybody's in love with. And obviously Ben Johnson doesn't go to Chicago if he doesn't see the immense upside that Caleb Williams still has. They got to solve the pocket awareness. Most of those sacks I blame on Williams. I realize the offensive line did not play well, but with DJ Moore still in the prime of his career, Dunze you would think is going to have a great NFL career. We talked earlier in this show about Cole Kmet maybe being a nice tight end value to target for next season. I think Ben Johnson, what he has to do is find, you never saw this with Chicago last year. Where are the easy throws? Where are the easy buttons? Where are the layup targets? My colleague Matt Harmon likes to talk about layup targets. How do you set your watch by get him in a rhythm? The Lions are so good with Jared Goff. Let's get him in a rhythm. Talk about, you don't like these plays? Let's take him out of the playbook. Right now, Ben Johnson and Caleb Williams are sorting through. What do you like to do? What platforms do you like to throw on? What angles do you like? What sides of the field do you like to throw on? Stuff like that. Ben Johnson is going to find Caleb. He's going to find the comfortable parts, or he's going to find the easy throws in the Caleb Williams playbook. And he's also going to have to teach him of what open really means in the NFL and when that clock goes off, when it's just better off to fight another day, throw the ball into the turf, throw the ball into the third row if you have to. You can't take 66 sacks again. But remember when Ben Johnson was linked with Jared Goff, nobody thought that was going to be a great marriage. And look at what it turned into. The Lions were an absolute carnival for 2 years. Caleb Williams needs a lot of work, needs a lot of development, but I can't imagine a better guy working with him right now than Ben Johnson.
May not be too long before Caleb Williams is the best quarterback in the NFC North, sticking in that division. What happened to Jordan Love this year, Scott? How concerned are you based on what you saw at the end of last season to what you saw over the course of this season, not only from Love's development, but the way that the Packers really transformed their offense into a power running game that featured a lot of Josh Jacobs with some Jordan Love, as opposed to a lot of Jordan Love last year with some Aaron Jones?
I just think the run out and understanding that maybe Jordan Love was over his skis the previous year. He had that really high touchdown rate. A lot of that is Matt LaFleur's scheming that goes into that. But just look at the run out this year. They play a 4 game and he gets hurt, and we're not even sure if he's going to play the rest of the season. And LaFleur does an amazing job getting Malik Willis to be competent, and the team stays afloat. I mean, I think the fact the Packers even made the playoffs this year is a huge feather in LaFleur's cap, but the receiver room was constantly hurt, and maybe Jacobs was better than they expected, and they rebranded themselves as this power offensive team, running team, and I think maybe to Love's detriment. I mean, maybe at some point you just have to say his development is more important. Even if we're a worse team today, we want to be a better team tomorrow. I think Jordan Love is a challenging guy for me to evaluate, and I'm looking forward to, during the offseason, rewatching a lot of these games and seeing some of the stuff I may have missed during the year, because there's just so much stuff going on. You can't see everything, but they need to find out. I know that they like all their receivers and they want to rotate them. They don't want anybody to play 100% of the time. But I think having a hierarchy in the receiver room, understanding that maybe we talked about maybe Watson might have to sit out a full year and just to lose your top off the defense guy is such a huge loss. But I think they need to rediscover what their hierarchy is with the receivers. And I think they need to put more on Jordan Love's plate next year if they ultimately aspire to be a championship team. I think he's a very difficult call right now. And I know you follow the Packers closely, so I welcome your call on Love as well. But I liked him this year. I was proactive on him. He did get hurt in the first week of the season. There's no way to know that stuff ahead of time. But obviously, like everybody else, I was disappointed in what I saw this year.
I think my sort of take on it was that the knee injury, while he recovered from it, I think he was just battling stuff like that most of the season. And that I don't want to blame the knee, because there was a pocket where Matt LaFleur said Jordan Love was playing his best football of his career this season. It was after the bye week when he had that extra time to rest, and he really was doing a wonderful job. I don't want to say being a game manager, but Jacobs took so much of his duties away from him that he didn't have to do a ton for the Packers to win those games in the soft part of their schedule. So I think you're right. It's going to be tough to evaluate him, but I do think he is going to drop. I mean, he was a fringe top 12 guy this past year. He's probably going to be going like maybe that Jared Goff range, quarterback 15, quarterback 16 this year. And then at that point, to me, he's worth the risk, because you're just counting on him to be a backup anyway. And if he comes through, great. If he doesn't, well, no hard feelings, Jordan.
Oh, I love that pocket. When you can draft him where it's great if he pops, but it doesn't kill you if he doesn't pop.
Yeah.
I mean, he still has a range of 35, 36 touchdown passes.
Yeah, I think he's a very good quarterback. I don't think he is an elite guy. I don't think he's ever going to be an elite guy. I could be wrong on that, but I think he's going to be a very good quarterback for a decade plus in the NFL. That's sort of been. Before he took over, I thought he was going to be all right. I thought he'd be above average. And then what I saw in I don't want to say his rookie year, but the first year he kind of took over, I'm like, okay, I think this guy's going to be very good. I think he's going to be very good for a long time. He's no Rodgers, he's no Favre, but he's the next notch and a half down from that. CJ Stroud. Actually, before we get to CJ Stroud, I want to end on CJ Stroud. Sam Darnold, as long as we're talking about the NFC North, where does he play in 2025, looking into the Pianowski crystal ball? Is he back in Minnesota? Is he somewhere else? What do you think?
I think he's on a different team. I think they have to let him go and commit to J.J. McCarthy. It breaks my heart the way he played the last 2 games of the season, because he did so much right. And Kevin O'Connell is somebody I have immense trust in. And we saw last year when Cousins got hurt, I mean, the passing game, there were mistakes, there were turnovers, but they still, with a collection of non-starters, really, they still kept the passing game creating downfield chunks. Aaron Glenn threw a great game plan at Darnold in week 18, and then Darnold, for whatever reason, couldn't do anything. All those sacks he took against the Rams holding on the ball. I don't think Addison and Jefferson actually did him all that many favors in those games either, but maybe the Raiders next year for Sam Darnold, I could see something like that. I think Sam Darnold is a starter in this league, and I think he can maybe be a plus starter. Maybe he can have why couldn't he be Kirk Cousins for the next 5 years?
Yeah, I'd love to see him in Las Vegas throwing balls to Brock Bowers and Jacoby Myers. Sign me up for that, for sure. Scott, final question. Why should or shouldn't we bet on a CJ Stroud bounce back in 2025?
It's going to depend on how you feel about the offensive line, because once that offensive line got shredded, he lost his confidence, he lost his nerve, he lost his pocket awareness, and they need a second pitch other than Nico Collins. It was a 1-year deal for Diggs. Obviously, Dell was hurt most of the year. Their tight ends are really not impactful players. Mixon is a back nine running back. He was good this year, but there's a player who needs his confidence to be rebuilt basically from square one.
I want to end on this. As a Brewers fan, we were all devastated to learn about Bob Uecker's passing last week. But he wasn't just Brewers. He was, Johnny Carson, Major League, Mr. Belvedere. We're going to miss him. What are you going to miss most about Bob Uecker? A guy who was average baseball player, but ascended into popular culture that I didn't think anybody saw coming.
Yeah, what happens with these announcers, your hometown announcers, he becomes a family member. When I first joined Yahoo and Fred Cusick, the longtime Bruins announcer, died, I went to them and said, look, this guy's like an uncle to me, even though I've never met him. Can I write the remembrance? Frank Schwab, my colleague at Yahoo, a Wisconsin guy, and Badger, and great, all together, one of my best friends. He went to Yahoo and said, please let me write the remembrance for Bob Uecker. He's a family member to me, basically, and that's how we feel about these guys. And the great Miller Lite commercials, the self-deprecation. Never took himself too seriously. Knew when to put the game first. Knew when to put levity first, and all the different ways you got to know him. You're a Brewer fan, you knew him. You were a Monday Night Baseball fan or a National fan, you knew him. You watched Carson, you knew him. You watched Major League movies, you knew him. He just felt like your friend. He felt like somebody you knew. And he had that skill, all the way the Brewers all talked about, the way Christian Yelich talked about him, like Jonathan LaCroix talked about him. He was a member of the team. They voted him a full playoff share.
Right. Unheard of.
Right.
Unheard of.
Because Bob Uecker was that guy. Because Bob Uecker made you feel like you were on top of the world. If you were watching baseball with him, you were fishing with him, you were talking with him, you were having a beer with him. Just a guy who understood what was important and understood what was worth laughing about, and a life well lived. Man, I'm going to miss him.
Yeah, I'm going to miss him too. We miss him already. Fantastic stuff from you, Scott. RIP Bob Uecker. As far as your other fantasy football content goes, yahoo.com is where to get it. Obviously, Scott_Pianowski on the X. Is that the best way to find out everything that you're working on?
For sure. And we're always in season, man. Fantasy football, fantasy baseball's kicking in. You can still draft a hockey or basketball league. We'll be doing March Madness stuff. So we're always in season at Yahoo. We know football is obviously the biggest sport. We're thrilled to talk football anytime you want us. But if you're like me and you dabble in everything else, we mentioned Bob Uecker. Fantasy baseball's not far away. Brewers coming off a great season. So let's do it.
Yeah, for sure. Scott, thank you so much. We'll have you back on real soon. I appreciate you hanging out with me tonight, man.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it, Eric.
Thank you so much. That is Scott Pianowski, Yahoo Fantasy Sports. I want to thank him and our producer, Matt Deutsch. We'll be back at 7 o'clock next Thursday with Jared Smola from DraftSharks.com. Check out the FFPC Never Too Early Best Ball tournaments and those Dynasty Orphans over at myffpc.com. For Matt Deutsch and Scott Pianowski, I'm Eric Balkman. This has been the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show on the Better Sports Network.